God damn! This kid lay still for years, then casually soul-fucked the symbol of peace mid-punch, turned the League into empty shells, and made international heroes drop like flies. Izuku didn't become a hero. He became the final boss with infinite futures. Hero Society got absolutely railed. This is the Almighty.
Welcome, legends, to Chronos Recom. I wrote this story myself, so if you have any suggestions or what-ifs you want to see, drop it in the comments below. Also, just wanted to let you know I've got a Patreon set up now for anyone who wants to support the channel directly. You can get early access to stories, submit direct fan requests, and get exclusive content. It's totally optional, but if you want to help keep these stories coming, check it out. Links in the description. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and hit that bell so you never miss an upload. Let's dive into this story.
The child did nothing for 4 years. He breathed, his heart beat, his eyes stayed shut. Every test the doctors ran came back clean. Brain activity normal, organ function normal, reflexes present when prompted. But Izuku Midoriya never moved on his own, never cried, never opened his eyes. He lay in his crib like something waiting, and Inko Midoriya spent 4 years believing her son was trapped somewhere inside himself, unreachable, fading in a way medicine refused to confirm. She talked to him every day. She changed him. She fed him through the methods the specialists taught her. She played music, she read stories, she pressed her face against his small chest and listened to the heartbeat that never wavered, never quickened, never slowed, regardless of what was happening around him. A perfectly steady rhythm that belonged to something older than the body producing it. The doctors said he might wake up one day. They said the brain scans showed activity consistent with deep processing, like a computer running calculations it was never designed to handle. One neurologist used the phrase soul-level integration as a joke during a late-night consult, and then spent 3 hours unable to explain why the phrase had come out of his mouth. Inko stopped inviting people over after the 2nd year. The neighbors talked. The other mothers at the park asked questions she had answers for, but refused to give. Her husband left during the 3rd year, packed a bag while the baby, who was now a toddler, lay motionless in the next room, and told her he was sorry, told her he loved her, told her he could feel something in that apartment watching him when he slept, and he could bear it anymore. She stayed. Of course she stayed. He was her son. The night everything changed was a Thursday. Inko was asleep on the couch, the television playing low, the apartment locked. A man came through the window. Takeshi Harada, 26 years old, petty thief with a strength enhancement quirk barely strong enough to bend a car antenna. He moved through the apartment looking for cash, electronics, anything portable. He found the woman on the couch and put a kitchen knife to her throat before she finished waking up. Inko screamed. She begged. She offered everything in the apartment and everything in her bank account and everything she would ever own if he would just leave. The thief told her to shut up. He moved through the apartment collecting valuables and, in passing, looking for jewelry, maybe, or a safe. He entered the child's room. His hand brushed across the face of the motionless boy on the bed. Something left Izuku in that instant. A fragment. A sliver of something so ancient and so vast that even its smallest piece carried transformative weight. It entered Takeshi Harada through skin contact and buried itself in the foundation of his soul before he took his next breath. He felt nothing. He left with 400,000 yen and a laptop and a pair of earrings. He climbed back out the window and disappeared into the Musutafu underbelly. Inko called the police. They came. They filed a report. They left. She checked on Izuku. He lay the same way he always lay, still, breathing, eyes shut, heart steady. Takeshi Harada woke up the next morning feeling like a god. His quirk, barely a footnote, barely enough to open a stuck jar, surged overnight into something monstrous. He punched a wall in his apartment and the wall ceased to exist. The wall behind it ceased to exist. The building groaned. He stumbled into the street and threw his fist at nothing, and the air cracked, and a parked car flipped 3 times and landed on its roof 40 meters away. He went to his gang that afternoon, and he went through them. Every rival who had ever pushed him around, every lieutenant who had taken his cut, every boss who had dismissed him as disposable muscle, he broke them the way a storm breaks fences. He won 17 fights in 36 hours, and the police couldn't find enough witnesses willing to talk because everyone who had seen him work was too afraid to describe what they had watched. On the third day, Takeshi Hirata picked a fight with 3 heroes simultaneously during a convenience store robbery in broad daylight. He killed one, he hospitalized the second. The third retreated and called for backup that arrived too late. On the 4th day, Takeshi Hirata's body gave out. The power inside him had expanded past what his vessel could contain, his muscles tearing themselves apart, his bones cracking under the pressure of something they were never built to house. He died in an alley behind a pachinko parlor at 3:47 in the morning, alone, his body burning from the inside out as the soul fragment consumed what remained. And the instant the life left him, every ounce of strength he had gained, every fight he had won, every moment of growth his body had experienced in those 4 days, all of it returned to its source. Izuku Midoriya opened his eyes. Inko was in the kitchen when she heard footsteps, small footsteps. The pad of bare feet on hardwood, a sound she had waited 4 years to hear. She dropped a glass and it shattered on the tile, and she ran to the hallway and stopped dead. Her son was standing, 4 years old, upright, his eyes open for the first time. And those eyes were wrong. They held something behind them that a child should never carry. They looked at her and they registered her, and there was recognition in them, but it was the recognition of someone who had already moved past her importance. Izuku? Her voice broke on the word. Baby? He looked at her for a long moment. His expression carried nothing she could read as childlike. Then he turned and walked toward the front door. Izuku, wait. He opened the door. He walked into the hallway. He walked toward the stairs that led down to the street. Inko grabbed him. She pulled him back. She wrapped her arms around him and held on with everything a mother has. And for 3 seconds, she thought she had him. Then the air in the hallway changed. It got heavy. The lights flickered. The walls seemed to pull inward 1/2 centimeter. And her arms went slack. Every muscle in her body softened like she had been submerged in warm water, and her grip failed, and her son stepped free of her embrace as easily as a man steps out of rain. He walked down the stairs. He walked out the front door of the building. He walked into the night of Musutafu, and he did this with the gait of someone who had done it 1,000 times before, in bodies that were taller and broader and built for war. Inko collapsed in the hallway. She screamed his name until her neighbors came. The police were called again. A missing child report was filed. Search parties went out for 3 weeks. They found nothing. Izuku Midoriya disappeared from the world at 4 years old, and the world would spend the next decade learning what he was building in its blind spots. The underground of Hero Society is larger than the surface admits. Beneath the shining towers and the Hero Agency billboards and the smiling faces of the top 10, there exists a world that runs on different rules. A world where quirk users whose abilities came with prices too high for polite society end up discarded. Where quirkless individuals scrape together lives in the margins of a culture that measures human value by what your body can produce on command. Izuku moved through this world like water through soil. Present everywhere, visible nowhere. The body of a child drew attention at first, but the attention never lasted. People who looked at him for too long reported headaches. People who tried to grab him or redirect him found their hands moving of their own accord to their sides, their legs, carrying them in the opposite direction. It was as if the world itself had decided to route around him, to treat him as a fixed object that everything else adjusted to. He was 5 years old when he recruited his first soldier. Her name was Rei Kuroda, 34 years old, former nurse. Quirk, cellular regeneration. She could heal wounds faster than any hospital, rebuild tissue, even restart stopped hearts with sustained contact. She had been invaluable until the day her quirk reversed, started breaking down the cells of anyone she touched instead of rebuilding them. She killed her daughter by accident during a hug. She killed her husband when he tried to restrain her afterward. She killed the first 3 police officers who responded. They found her in an abandoned subway station, living in the dirt. her hands wrapped in chains she had stolen from a construction site. Chains she wound around her own fingers to stop herself from touching anything alive. Izuku walked into that station alone. He was 5 years old and barely taller than a fire hydrant, and he walked into the dwelling of a woman who killed everything she touched. She screamed at him to leave. She threw debris at him. A piece of rebar struck his shoulder and bent against his skin without leaving a mark. He kept walking toward her. "What are you?" she whispered. "I am the answer to the question you stopped asking." His voice, a child's voice, carrying words that had no business in a child's mouth. "You believed your power was a curse. It is a weapon looking for the correct wielder." He reached toward her. She flinched back. Her chains rattled. "Touch me," he said, "and understand." She didn't mean to. Her hand moved on its own, drawn by something pulling from inside her chest. Her fingers made contact with his outstretched palm. Her quirk fired. The full destructive output slammed into the body of a 5-year-old boy. His cells rebuilt faster than she could break them. His skin rippled and reformed so quickly that the process looked like light refracting through water. She pushed harder. Instinct, desperation, and he stood there absorbing every ounce of her output without a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. Then something moved from him into her. A fragment. A piece of soul that slid into the foundation of her being and restructured everything it touched. Rei Kuroda's scream echoed through the station. When it stopped, she was on her knees, and her quirk, her beautiful, murderous, uncontrollable quirk, sat inside her like a tamed animal. Controllable. Directional, and 300 times more powerful than it had ever been. She looked up at the child standing over her. Tears ran down her face. "What did you do?" "I gave you what you were owed." She became his first Sternritter. The letter R, the reverse. She could accelerate cellular decay in anything she touched, to the point where buildings aged 1,000 years in seconds, where flesh turned to dust, where steel corroded to nothing. And she could reverse the process, heal wounds that would kill any other person, rebuild bodies from the edge of death. She asked him once, years later, why he had come to her, why the woman in the subway station. He looked at her with those eyes, those layered, impossible eyes, and said, "Because you had already killed the version of yourself that would have refused me. I only collect the willing." By the time Izuku was 8, he had 14 soldiers. By the time he was 10, he had 40. By the time he was 12, the Wandenreich existed as a fully operational shadow empire, an organization housed in pockets of space that existed between the physical locations the hero world monitored, dimensional folds that Izuku had torn open through sheer spiritual force. The headquarters sat in what he called the Silburn, a palace of white stone and blue light that existed in the gap between 2 abandoned subway systems beneath Musutafu. You could stand directly above it and feel nothing. You could drive a sensor through the ground and detect nothing. It existed outside the physics this world understood. His soldiers wore white. They carried weapons made from condensed spiritual energy, bows, swords, lances, configurations unique to each bearer. Every one of them had received a soul fragment. Every one of them had been transformed into something beyond what the hero world could categorize. And every one of them, if they died, returned everything they had gained back to Izuku. The power, the experience, the knowledge. All of it flowed home. He was building an army. But more than that, he was building an engine. Every soldier who grew stronger made his inevitable victory larger. Every fragment he distributed was an investment that paid compound returns upon collection. He was 14 when he Tuya Todoroki. The forest was burning. Not the controlled burns that forestry services managed. This was chaos fire, the kind that moved too fast in too many directions with too much heat. Satellite imagery would later show the blaze covered 9 square kilometers. Fire response teams were pulling back. The area was being written off. Izuku walked into it. The fire didn't touch him. Flames bent around his body the way water bends around a stone in a river. The heat, temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees in concentrated pockets, pressed against his skin and found veiny waiting. He walked through walls of blue-white flame, the way a person walks through a light mist. At the center, Toya, 23 years old. His skin falling off his body in sheets of burned and grafted tissue. His quirk, cremation fire, hotter than anything his father could produce, pouring out of him without control, without direction, without end. He had been here for hours, maybe days. He was laughing and crying simultaneously, his voice raw, his body eating itself alive from the power it was forced to produce. He saw Izuku coming through the flames and his laughter stopped. A child, 14 years old, walking through fire that had driven back professional heroes, walking toward him with a pace that suggested the inferno was a mild inconvenience. Izuku stopped 3 meters from him. The flames raged between them and around them and above them. Neither of them burned. "Who?" Tuya started. "Your father gave you fire and denied you the vessel to hold it." Izuku's voice cut through the roar of the blaze without rising in volume. "He bred you for a purpose and discarded you when the product failed to match his specifications. I will give you the heat of a sun and the body to hold every degree of it." Tuya stared. The flames sputtered. His output wavered for the first time in hours, the shock breaking through even the feedback loop his quirk had trapped him in. You're a kid." "I am older than the concept of fire," Izuku extended his hand. "Take what I offer, or stay here and burn until there is nothing left to burn. The choice belongs to you, Tuya Todoroki. But understand, I only offer once." Tuya looked at that hand. He looked at the flames around them, his flames, his prison, the inheritance his father had packed into his genes without caring whether the container could survive the contents. He took the hand. The soul fragment transferred. Tuya's body seized, every nerve firing simultaneously, every cell restructuring around the new foundation being laid inside him. The flames surrounding them changed color. They went from blue-white to something beyond the visible spectrum, a frequency that the human eye registered as absence rather than presence. Fire so hot it looked like a hole in reality, and Tuya's skin, the grafts, the burns, the constant destruction his own output caused, healed, rebuilt, reinforced. His body restructured itself around the new power coursing through it, and for the first time in his adult life, Tuya Todoroki's flesh was whole, complete. Built to hold exactly what it was producing, he fell to his knees in the center of a dying fire. He looked at his hands, unmarked, unburned, whole, and he made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Izuku stood over him. "You are Sternritter B, the burn. Everything that was taken from you, your father's attention, your body's integrity, your right to exist as yourself, I return it now. What you do with it belongs to you, but you belong to me." Tuya looked up at the 14-year-old standing in the ashes. The forest around them was silent. 9 square kilometers of fire had extinguished the moment his power came under control. "What are you?" he asked. "The answer your father spent his entire career trying to breed. Tuya, who the world would call Dabi, who had spent years in the margins, who had been a weapon that destroyed its own wielder, stood in that burned clearing and felt whole for the first time in 23 years. He bowed. Because what else do you do when something like this appears and gives you back yourself? Himiko Toga came 6 months later. Izuku found her in the sewers beneath Hosu's city. 16 years old, covered in blood, some hers, most belonging to others. Her quirk demanded it. Her nature demanded it. The world had told her this demand made her a monster, and she had spent enough years hearing it that she had stopped disagreeing. She was eating when he appeared. Crouched over a stolen bento box, her yellow eyes catching the light from a grate above, her clothes torn and stained and inadequate for the season, he sat across from her. On the filthy sewer floor, cross-legged, a 14-year-old boy with eyes that held something infinite behind them, she hissed at him. "Go away. I'll cut you. You were told your nature was monstrous." He spoke as if she hadn't threatened him. "I say it is a gift. I will make it limitless." She blinked. The knife in her hand trembled, because his voice carried something she had never heard directed at her before. Acceptance. Total, complete acceptance of what she was, delivered without conditions or caveats or the careful distance that even the kindest people maintained around her. You're just saying that. Everyone says something and then I do not say things I lack the means to deliver. He reached into his coat and produced a small container. Blood. Fresh. Drink. And then let me show you what you become. She stared at the container. She stared at him. Her instincts, the ones that had kept her alive on the streets, the ones that screamed whenever someone got close, went silent. For the first time in years, the warning bells in her head stopped ringing. She drank. The soul fragment entered her the moment the blood touched her lips. It buried itself in her transformation quirk and expanded it beyond every boundary the doctors and researchers had mapped. Himiko Toga, who could mimic the appearance of anyone whose blood she consumed, became something else entirely. She could now become them. Fully, completely. Quirk included, memories included, physical capabilities included. She consumed a sample and she became the person at their absolute peak, with full access to everything they were. She dropped the container. Her body shifted, rippled through 6 faces she had stored before settling back into her own. Her eyes went wide. I can feel them. All of them. Everything they... You are Sternritter T, the transform. Izuku stood. You are the most dangerous infiltrator alive. No system can detect you because you are the person you become. You carry my gift and my protection. What was done to you will be done to the world that did it. Tears ran down her cheeks and mixed with the blood that already stained them. She smiled, the first genuine smile she had worn since childhood. You actually mean it. I have never said a thing I failed to mean. She followed him out of the sewer. She followed him into the Silburn. She followed him to the end of the world, and she did it gladly, because he was the first person who had ever looked at what she was and said yes instead of recoiling. The Wandenreich grew. Names that the hero world would learn to fear filled the ranks. 43 Sternritter, each carrying a letter, each transformed beyond their original capabilities. They came from every corner of the discarded world. Failed heroes, abandoned victims, quirkless individuals who were given abilities from scratch through the raw power of Izuku's soul fragments. The hero world noticed. Of course it noticed. You cannot disappear that many people, even people the system had already written off, without leaving traces. Reports began appearing on the desks of the Hero Public Safety Commission. Unusual quirk readings in abandoned regions. Individuals who had been classified as inactive or deceased suddenly reappearing with energy signatures that broke existing measurement scales. Witnesses in underground communities reporting figures in white, organized, armed, moving with military discipline through areas no hero patrol touched. Hawks filed 17 reports in a single year. Each one described the same pattern. Someone who had been living on society's margins suddenly vanishing, and a brief spike in spiritual energy at the location they had last been seen. The commission read each report. They categorized the threat level as monitoring. They did not understand what they were monitoring. Endeavor pushed for investigation. He had heard things. Rumors from the underground, whispers about a child who led an army. He dismissed most of it. A child? Commanding 40-plus enhanced combatants? It sounded like urban legend. Villain mythology that the lower tiers cooked up to explain disappearances they caused themselves. Then 3 of his sidekicks vanished during a routine patrol. Their GPS went offline simultaneously. Their emergency beacons never activated. When forensics swept the area, they found residual energy readings that their equipment could identify as energy but couldn't categorize by type. It matched nothing in the existing quirk database. Endeavor requested a full tactical response. The commission authorized observation only. They were watching, waiting, trying to understand the shape of what was building in their blind spots. They would understand too late. The day Izuku turned 15, the Wandenreich was ready. 43 Sternritter, a palace in the shadows. Resources accumulated over a decade of operation in the spaces the hero world refused to patrol. And at the center, the father, the emperor. A 15-year-old body containing a soul that had once held dominion over everything between life and death. He sat on his throne in the Silburn, white stone, blue light pulsing through the walls in patterns that matched his heartbeat. The Sternritter arrayed before him, Tuya at the right hand, Toga at the left, 41 others standing in formation. He looked at them. Every one of them carried a piece of his soul. Every one of them had been remade by his hand. He saw the futures branching from this moment, saw them all simultaneously through Die Allmacht, and in every version of events, the hero world ended. Today, he said, and his voice filled the chamber without rising above a conversational tone, we announce ourselves. The world above has built a temple to a lie, a system that measures worth by power and then punishes those whose power fails to serve its interests. Every person in this room was discarded by that system. Every person in this room was told they were broken or wrong or insufficient. He stood. The weight of him pressed outward, spiritual pressure rolling through the chamber like a tide coming in. I tell you now, you were never broken. You were incomplete. And I have completed you. What we do today, what we begin today, is the final correction. The world above will resist. Heroes will stand in our path. The system will rally its champions and its symbols and its borrowed strength. His eyes shifted. Multiple pupils cascaded outward from his irises, the activation of Die Allmacht visible in his gaze. I have already seen their resistance. I have already seen its failure. Every future in which they stop us has been removed. Every timeline in which we fall has been erased. There remains only the future I have chosen. And in that future, we stand over everything. The stern Ritter saluted, fists to chests, white uniforms gleaming. Go, Izuku said, and be what you were always meant to become. The shadow gates opened. The Wandenreich moved UA High School was hosting the annual Combat Foundation Assessment, a large-scale training exercise conducted during the first month of the school year. Class 1A and Class 1B combined, supervised by 6 pro heroes, observed by press representatives from 4 major networks. The event was designed to demonstrate the caliber of students UA produced. It was a showcase, a statement of the hero world's strength. Cameras were rolling. 32 students occupied the main training ground, a massive outdoor facility that simulated urban environments. Eraserhead patrolled the observation deck alongside Midnight, Present Mike, and 3 guest heroes who had volunteered to demonstrate advanced combat techniques. The weather was clear. The morning sun sat high and clean above the artificial buildings. Katsuki Bakugo was mid-exercise, detonating his way through a mock villain scenario, his explosions echoing across the grounds. Shoto Todoroki moved through a parallel course, his ice and fire alternating with the discipline his training had beaten into him. The other students of 1A scattered across their assigned scenarios, performing for the cameras, growing under observation. The weather changed. It happened in a single breath. The sky, clear moments ago, went the color of bruised iron. The shadows on the ground stretched in the wrong direction, pulling away from the sun instead of following it. The temperature dropped 8 degrees in 2 seconds. Every student on the field stopped moving simultaneously, as if a signal had been broadcast that their bodies received before their minds could process. Eraserhead stood. His eyes swept the grounds. His capture weapon lifted off his shoulders and coiled in his hands. Something was wrong in a way his instincts recognized, but his experience couldn't categorize. All students, he spoke into the PA system, returned to the observation deck immediately. This is an emergency withdrawal order. They didn't get the chance. The air in the center of the training field split open. A vertical line of blue-white light carved through the space between 2 artificial buildings. It widened, a door opening from somewhere else into here, and through it stepped a figure in white. Izuku Midoriya, 15 years old. 6 feet of lean frame wrapped in a white long coat that moved in a wind the physical world wasn't producing. Green hair swept back from a face that carried zero expression beyond absolute certainty. And his eyes, those eyes with their cascading pupils, their layered depth, swept across the training ground and found every person present. The spiritual pressure hit. It came in waves. The first wave pressed every student to the ground like gravity had tripled. Ochako Uraraka, mid-run toward the observation deck, hit the concrete knees first, her body folding against a force she couldn't see or understand. Tenya Ida's engines sputtered and died in his calves, the internal combustion that powered his speed, suffocating under something his body couldn't identify. The second wave reached the pro heroes on the observation deck. Present Mike tried to use his voice quirk. He opened his mouth and the sound that came out was a whisper. His ability was drowning, the spiritual pressure pressing down on whatever internal mechanism generated his power and reducing it to nothing. Midnight reached for her sleep gas. Her pores produced nothing. Her quirk refused to respond to her command, sitting dormant inside her as if it had been switched off. Eraserhead locked his eyes on the figure below. His erasure activated, the full force of his quirk pushing toward the intruder, seeking the quirk factor, seeking the biological mechanism that generated this power so he could sever the connection between user and ability. He found nothing. His erasure searched and found no quirk factor, no biological mechanism. What he was sensing from this figure wasn't coming from genes or mutation or any enhancement the world recognized. It came from somewhere deeper, somewhere his ability couldn't reach. Izuku looked up at him, directly at him, through the distance and the chaos and the 32 students struggling on the ground between them. You attempt to erase the creator with the tools he provided. His voice carried without effort. Every person on the grounds heard it with perfect clarity, as if he were speaking directly into each individual ear. Eraserhead went still. In 15 years of heroism, facing villains who could level buildings, who could rewrite matter, who could twist space, he had never encountered something his erasure couldn't touch. The foundation of his entire combat philosophy was built on the certainty that any power rooted in biology could be shut down by his eyes. This wasn't rooted in biology. This was something else entirely. Izuku raised his right hand. Above him, manifesting from particles of energy the cameras captured as scattered blue light, a bow appeared. Massive, easily 20 meters across, made from condensed spiritual energy that hummed at a frequency the ground vibrated in sympathy with. Sank Bogan. The students, still conscious enough to look upwards, saw it form. Momo Yaoyorozu, genius-level intellect, top of her class, watched the weapon materialize, and her brain ran through every recorded quirk in the national database trying to match what she was seeing. It matched nothing. It followed no known pattern. It existed outside her framework entirely. Izuku drew the bow. A single arrow of concentrated reishi manifested against the string, blazing blue-white, dense enough that the air around it evaporated. He released. The arrow crossed the distance between Izuku and the primary training facility in less than a heartbeat. It struck the center of the 3-story reinforced structure, concrete walls 6 feet thick, steel-reinforced framing designed to withstand the combined output of 20 students at maximum capacity. The building didn't explode, didn't collapse, it ceased. Where a training facility had stood a moment ago, there was now open air and a crater. Clean. Complete. As if the building had been lifted out of reality and the space where it existed was simply empty now. 3 seconds of absolute silence followed, then screaming. Students who could move scrambled toward the edges of the training ground. Those who couldn't move, pinned by spiritual pressure, screamed where they lay. The cameras, still running, the operators frozen in their observation booths, captured everything. Katsuki Bakugo was on his feet. He shouldn't have been. The spiritual pressure bearing down on the training ground should have pinned him like everyone else. But Bakugo's body operated on spite the way other bodies operated on oxygen. His muscles screamed against the weight. His quirk sputtered, the nitroglycerin in his palms refusing to ignite properly under the suppressive field. But his legs worked, and his fury worked, and he launched himself forward. He closed 30 meters in 4 seconds. His palms finally sparked, a fraction of their normal output, maybe 15%, but enough to propel him forward in a blast of force that carried him toward the figure in white. Who the hell are you? Izuku didn't turn. Bakugo's trajectory, the angle of approach, timing of the detonation, the exact point where his fist would make contact, had been visible in Izuku's field of awareness since before the boy decided to move. The future in which that fist connected had already been selected for removal. Bakugo's right arm seized mid-swing. Every muscle from shoulder to fingertip locked simultaneously. His momentum carried him forward, and his body hit the ground in a rolling crash that sent him skidding across the concrete until he stopped face down 15 meters from where Izuku stood. He tried to get up. His arm wouldn't respond. It wasn't injured. The bones were intact, the muscles undamaged. It simply refused to obey. The future where that arm completed its motion had been taken out of existence. Bakugo screamed. It was rage and confusion, and something he would never admit was fear. Shoto Todoroki moved next. Ice erupted from his right side, a glacier's worth of frozen mass rushing toward the figure in white at the speed of a bullet train. Simultaneously, fire erupted from his left. A column of heat that would have made Endeavor proud. A full output blast from a boy who rarely used his full output. Ice and fire. Both sides. Everything Shoto had launched at the same target from 15 meters. Izuku looked at the attacks coming. His expression carried nothing that resembled concern. The ice reached him first. It hit Blutvini and shattered. 20 tons of frozen mass broke apart against his skin like glass hitting diamond. The shards scattered in every direction, raining across the training ground in a glittering cascade that would have looked beautiful under any other circumstances. The fire hit a half-second later. 2,000 degrees of concentrated heat washed over his body and accomplished nothing. He stood in the flames the way a person stands in gentle rain, aware of it, unbothered by it, waiting for it to pass. When both attacks ended, Izuku stood unmarked. His coat wasn't singed, his hair hadn't moved. Shoto Todoroki, the son of the number 2 hero, the product of a breeding program designed to produce the ultimate hero, stared at the result of his full output and felt something collapse inside his chest. Your father, Izuku said, looking at Shoto with an expression that bordered on recognition, spent decades trying to create what I was born remembering. The irony is wasted on you, for now. He turned away from the students. He turned away from the heroes on the observation deck. He faced the cameras. Hear me, he said. I am Izuku Midoriya. I am the father of the new empire. The system you have built, the hierarchy of heroes, the worship of power without understanding, the lie that a society built on fear of villains constitutes peace, ends today. This is your only declaration of war. There will be no second announcement. He raised his hand, palm upward to the bruised sky. What comes next is inevitability. He stepped backward into the shadow his own body cast and vanished. The sky returned to its clean blue. The spiritual pressure lifted like a hand releasing a throat. Students gasped and retched and scrambled to their feet. Heroes rushed to the edge of the observation deck, shouting orders that came too late to matter. The training facility was gone. Bakugo was on the ground with an arm that still refused to move. Shoto was standing in a field of shattered ice, his fires dead, staring at the empty space where the intruder had been, and the cameras had caught all of it. The footage was live. 34 million viewers had been watching the UA showcase when the sky turned wrong, and a boy in white stepped out of nothing. The reactions came in tidal waves. Social media collapsed under the weight of simultaneous responses. The clip of the training facility vanishing one moment present, the next simply absent, was shared 400,000 times in the first hour. The clip of Izuku's voice, "You attempt to erase the creator with the tools he provided," became the most quoted audio file in Japanese internet history within 3 hours. Heroes across the country watched the footage. They watched their colleagues pinned by an invisible force. They watched Eraserhead's quirk fail for the first time in recorded history. They watched a 15-year-old boy erase a building with a bow that manifested from nothing and then declare war on everything they represented. In his office, Endeavor watched the footage 7 times. He paused it on the moment his son's ice shattered against Izuku's body. He paused it on the moment his son's fire achieved nothing. He watched his legacy, the entire Todoroki project, be dismissed as irrelevant by a teenager who didn't bother to dodge. His fist went through his desk. At the Hero Public Safety Commission headquarters, 12 senior officials convened an emergency session. The energy readings from UA arrived 20 minutes after the incident. Readings their equipment couldn't classify, measuring force at levels that exceeded their instruments' upper limits. What the hell is this? Director Kaori Matsuda stared at the printout. This doesn't read like anything. Our machines don't have a category for this. The erasure failure is what concerns me. Hawks, present via hologram from his field position, leaned forward. Eraserhead's ability has never failed against a quirk user. If this individual doesn't register as a quirk user, everyone has a quirk factor, Matsuda interrupted. The readings suggest otherwise. Hawks pulled up the sensor data from UA, no quirk factor detected on the target. 0 biological enhancement markers. The energy signature is coming from, I don't know where it's coming from. It doesn't match any model we have. Silence in the room. 12 people whose entire career was built on understanding and managing quirks stared at data that told them something existed outside their understanding. Who is he? Someone asked. Hawks pulled up the file. Izuku Midoriya, age 15, officially classified as quirkless since age 4. Disappeared from his mother's apartment 10 years ago. Missing child case went cold after 8 months. No sightings, no leads, no trace. Until today. Quirkless, Matsuda repeated. He's quirkless. And he did that. Nobody in the room had an answer that fit. The footage played again on the wall screen. The training facility disappearing. Bakugo hitting the ground. Shoto's attacks breaking against skin. Heroes dropping to their knees from something invisible. Somewhere in that room, every person present understood that the rules had changed. And every person present understood that they had no response prepared for what those rules had changed into. Yhwach Midoriya saw the footage. She was in her apartment, the same building. She had stayed 11 years, waiting, filing reports, checking databases, contacting every agency, every hero, every authority that might have the reach to find a child who had walked out of her life at 4 years old. She saw his face on the screen and her teacup hit the floor. He was taller now. His hair was the same green. That impossible, vivid green she had stared at during 4 years of silence. His eyes were different. They had always been different, since the moment he opened them, but now they held something that the camera captured and the viewer felt. Izuku. She said his name to the screen, her hand pressed against the glass. What happened to you? The camera showed him erasing a building. The camera showed him declaring war on every institution she had begged to find him. The camera showed her son, her baby who had never moved for 4 years, who she had held and fed and talked to and loved without receiving a single response. Standing in the center of a destroyed training ground and telling the world it was over, she called the police. She called them again. She called every number she had accumulated over 11 years of searching. None of them had answers. All of them wanted to ask her questions. She couldn't answer. Her son was alive. Her son had walked into her life as a mystery and walked out as something worse. And now the entire world was watching him be something she couldn't recognize. She kept the television on. She would keep it on for months. Every appearance, every report, every rumor and sighting and analysis, she consumed all of it, looking for something, anything, that still resembled the child she had spent 4 years trying to reach through silence. All for One watched the footage in his reinforced chamber beneath Camino Ward. His sensor arrays had detected the spiritual pressure spike before the broadcast even began. Readings that sent his monitoring equipment into cascade failure, values that his systems interpreted as errors because the alternative was admitting something existed at those levels. He watched a 15-year-old boy erase a building from UA's campus. He watched Eraserhead's quirk fail. He watched the declaration of war, delivered with the confidence of someone who had already won. And for the first time in 200 years, All for One felt something he hadn't experienced since he was young enough to remember fear. He felt recognized. Because what he saw on that screen, the presence, the absolute authority, the power delivered without performance or justification, looked like what he had spent 2 centuries trying to become. And it existed in a 15-year-old body that moved like it had already lived 1,000 lifetimes. Interesting, he said to the empty chamber. His voice was steady because he had practiced steadiness for 200 years, but his hands, hidden beneath the table, away from any camera, his hands trembled. Shigaraki watched from his bar. His hand scratched his neck until it bled. "What the hell?" he said. "What the hell is that?" Kurogiri wiped a glass and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The world was watching. The world was afraid. And somewhere in the spaces between shadow and light, in a palace of white stone, a boy who remembered being a god sat on his throne and waited for what would come next. It didn't take long. 3 weeks after the UA incident, All for One made his move. He left his chamber. For the first time in years, he moved through the streets of Camino Ward in person, or what remained of his person. His body, sustained by dozens of regenerative and support quirks, carried the weight of 2 centuries of stolen power. He moved with escorts. His remaining Nomu flanked him. His presence pushed civilians aside the way a ship pushes water. He broadcast his challenge openly. A message delivered through every underground channel simultaneously, routed through networks that only the true power players of Japan's criminal world could access. The boy who declared himself Emperor. I want to meet you. Camino Ward. Tomorrow night, come alone or come with your army. It makes no difference to me. Izuku received the message. He smiled, the first expression besides absolute certainty anyone had ever seen on his face. It was a small smile. The kind a chess player wears when their opponent makes the move they predicted 6 turns ago. He went alone, Camino Ward, at midnight. The district had been evacuated by All for One's presence alone, civilians fleeing a weight in the air that their instincts translated as death. The streets were empty. The buildings stood dark. At the center of a wide intersection, All for One waited. Izuku emerged from a shadow cast by a destroyed streetlight. He walked toward the center of the intersection with the same unhurried pace he carried everywhere. The walk of someone who has never needed to rush because his time is a resource that belongs to him. They faced each other across 30 meters of empty road. All for One spoke first. I've been alive for 200 years. I've taken power from thousands. I've broken every symbol of peace your world has produced. I am the boogeyman they built heroes to stop. He tilted his head, the mask covering his destroyed face shifting with the motion. And I have never sensed anything like you. Izuku looked at him. His eyes shifted, multiple pupils cascading outward, Die Allmacht activating in full. Every future that branched from this moment spread before him. Every possible attack All for One could produce, every combination of his stolen quirks, every strategy, every contingency, every desperate last resort, Izuku saw them all simultaneously. You hoard stolen scraps and call yourself a demon lord. Izuku's voice carried the same authority it always did, the same absence of performance. You are a scavenger. You take what others have built and wear it like armor, because without it, you are nothing. I do not take, I give. The distinction is everything. All for One's presence flared. 200 years of accumulated quirks activating in unison, the air around him distorting, the ground beneath him cracking, the buildings on either side of the street groaning under the weight of his full spiritual signature. Let's test that philosophy, All for One said. Shall we? He moved. The first attack was an air cannon, 5 layers of kinetic amplification stacked behind a compressed blast of air so dense it approached the density of steel. The output was enough to level a city block. The shockwave alone shattered every window in a 300-meter radius. Izuku didn't move. The blast reached the point in space where his body stood and passed through air. He was standing in the same location. He hadn't dodged, hadn't jumped, hadn't flickered away. The attack had simply failed to connect because Izuku had reached into the future where it landed and removed that future from existence. All for One blinked behind his mask. His sensors, biological and mechanical, confirmed the attack had been launched, confirmed the trajectory, confirmed the force. It should have hit. It could have hit. But the version of reality where it did was simply gone. He launched a second combination: kinetic enhancement, strength multiplier, gravitational compression, impact reversal. 4 quirks in concert, producing a strike that carried enough force to crater mountains. He closed the distance in a fraction of a second. His fist aimed at Izuku's center mass. His fist passed through empty air. Izuku stood 2 meters to the left of where All for One's strike connected with nothing, the same position he had occupied before. He had been there the entire time. The future where All for One's targeting was accurate had been rewritten. In this timeline, the only timeline that still existed, he had aimed wrong. He had always aimed wrong. The punch that should have landed was a punch that could never have landed. You are fighting a future that I have already decided does not exist, Izuku said. His voice carried something that might have been patience. Every attack you launch arrives in a timeline where I have already removed it. You are throwing punches at memories of a reality I erased before you formed the thought. All for One went still. Then he erupted. Everything. 200 years of accumulated power. Every offensive quirk he had ever stolen. Every combination he had ever developed. Every emergency technique he had reserved for the moment when the world finally produced something that required his full attention. He launched all of it simultaneously. The street detonated. Buildings on both sides of the intersection came apart from the shockwave alone. The ground cratered 10 meters deep. The air itself seemed to burn. Heat and force and kinetic energy and gravitational warping and molecular disruption and a dozen other effects all layered on top of each other in a display of raw, destructive force that hadn't been seen in Japan since the fall of All Might. When the dust cleared, and it took a long time to clear, Izuku stood in the exact center of the devastation. His white coat was undamaged. His hair was unmoved. His expression hadn't changed. "Are you finished?" he asked. All for One's breathing was ragged. His body, sustained by regenerative quirks, was already repairing the damage his own output had caused to his vessel. But his mind, 200 years of tactical genius, was running calculations that all arrived at the same answer. Nothing he had could reach this boy. How? All for One whispered. "How are you? What are you?" "I am what you spent 2 centuries failing to become." Izuku began walking forward. His steps were steady. The ground beneath his feet was smooth, the damage from All for One's assault stopping exactly at the boundary of his body, as if the destruction had been afraid to touch him. "You stole power from others because you had none of your own. You accumulated because you feared insufficiency. You built your empire on theft and called it strength." He stopped 3 meters from All for One. "I was born with everything. I have always had everything. The difference between us is that you needed this meeting to understand what you are. I knew what you were before you sent your message." All for One pulled back. His body readied, every defensive quirk activating simultaneously, every layer of protection he had accumulated over 2 centuries deploying at maximum output. Izuku moved. Blut artery activated. His physical capabilities elevated to a level that the human body was never designed to achieve. He crossed 3 meters in a time interval that All for One's perception couldn't register. His hand closed around All for One's face, fingers pressed against the mask, against the skin beneath it, against the skull that held 2 centuries of stolen memory. Sanct Altar activated. The pulling began. All for One screamed. It was the sound of 200 years of accumulation being torn free. Every quirk he had ever taken, every power he had ever stored, every fragment of stolen ability ripping itself out of his soul and flowing into Izuku's hand. The process was total. The process was absolute. There was no defense against it because this wasn't a fight. This was collection. This was a creditor claiming what was owed. Quirk after quirk tore free. Strength enhancers, speed multipliers, elemental abilities, transformation quirks, sensory powers, regenerative factors, hundreds of them. Hundreds of stolen lives worth of accumulated power, all of it flowing out of All for One and into Izuku like water running downhill. It took 30 seconds. In those 30 seconds, All for One experienced 2 centuries of power leaving his body in reverse. Every theft undone, every stolen moment returned to its proper owner. He felt himself become less with each passing instant. Smaller, weaker, more human, more empty. When it ended, Izuku released his grip. All for One hit the ground. No, All for One collapsed. His body, without the regenerative quirks sustaining it, immediately began failing. His destroyed face, unsupported by the healing factors that had kept it functional, contorted in pain that no longer had a buffer. His limbs, without the strength enhancements holding them upright, went slack. He was alive. He was powerless. 200 years of accumulated dominance gone in 30 seconds. Every stolen quirk, every layered defense, every accumulated advantage that had allowed him to sit at the top of the criminal world for longer than anyone alive could remember. All of it was inside Izuku now. Izuku looked down at the man on the ground, at what was left, at 2 centuries of ambition reduced to a broken body on a destroyed street. "You spent 200 years building a collection," Izuku said. "I spent 30 seconds making it mine. Consider what that tells you about the distance between us." All for One wept, his body, frail now, small now, unsustained, shook with sobs that had 200 years of suppressed terror behind them. He had been afraid of this. Somewhere, in the back of a mind that had convinced itself it feared nothing, this exact scenario had existed as a nightmare. Being stripped, being reduced, being made to feel what his victims felt. He looked up at Izuku through the remains of his mask. What will you do?" Izuku had already turned away. "I will do what I have always done. I will move forward. You are behind me now." He walked into the shadows. He left All for One on the ground in the ruins of Kamino Ward. Alive, powerless, weeping, and for the first time in 2 centuries, completely and utterly alone. The aftermath spread like a disease through the villain underground. All for one, the invisible emperor of Japan's criminal world, the puppet master who had controlled events from the shadows for longer than the current government had existed, was powerless. The network that had sustained the League of Villains collapsed overnight. Nomu production ceased. Arms channels went silent. The infrastructure that All for One had spent 2 centuries building crumbled in days because everything had been held together by one man's power, and that power now resided in someone else. The criminal world panicked. Organizations that had operated under All for One's protection suddenly found themselves exposed. Networks that had relied on his intelligence suddenly ran blind. The vacuum was immediate, total, and terrifying. And into that vacuum, the Wandenreich expanded. Tuya, now operating openly under the letter B, moved through the criminal underground like wildfire. Literally. Organizations that refused to acknowledge the new order found their headquarters burning at temperatures that melted the foundations into glass. Organizations that bent the knee were absorbed. Their resources, their territory, their personnel, all of it folded into the Wandenreich's expanding footprint. Toga infiltrated the hero world simultaneously. Wearing faces she had no right to wear, moving through hero agencies and government buildings with perfect mimicry, gathering information and planting seeds of confusion that would bloom into chaos when the time came. Within 6 weeks of All for One's fall, the Wandenreich controlled 80% of Japan's criminal infrastructure. Within 8 weeks, they had operatives embedded in 6 of the top 10 hero agencies. Within 10 weeks, the world that had existed before Izuku's declaration at UA was unrecognizable. And the heroes were losing. Hawks was the first to understand the scale of what they faced. He had sources in the underground, deep sources, people he had spent years cultivating. One by one, those sources went silent, either recruited or eliminated. The network he had built over his entire career evaporated in weeks. He filed his final report to the commission with a single concluding line: "We are dealing with something that has already won. We just haven't realized it yet." The League of Villains made their move 6 weeks after All for One's fall. Shigaraki, Spinner, twice, Mr. Compress. The remnants of an organization that had lost its foundation but still carried the delusion that they mattered in the new landscape. They reached out to the Wandenreich through intermediaries, seeking alliance, seeking relevance, seeking a seat at the table that was being set. Izuku received their request from his throne. He read it the way a person reads junk mail, with brief attention and immediate dismissal. "They believe themselves to be players," he said to Tuya, who stood at his right hand. "They believe the game is one they can still participate in." "Want me to burn them?" Tuya's question was practical. Easy. Their power is borrowed. Their purpose was given to them by a man I have already broken. They carry fragments of influence I have already claimed. Izuku stood. "I will handle this personally. There is something I want back." He raised his right hand toward the ceiling of the Silburn. His palm faced upward. His eyes, already active with Die Allmacht, saw the futures branching from this moment. He selected the one he wanted. "Oswalen," he said. The light descended from somewhere above existence. A pillar of brilliance, pure white, absolute, total, fell from a sky the League of Villains couldn't see onto a building they thought was hidden. Shigaraki felt it first. A pulling. A tearing. Something reaching into his body and gripping the power at his core. The decay he had been born with, the enhancements All for One had given him, the potential that was being cultivated in his cells, and ripping it upward, he screamed. His hands, those hands that destroyed everything they touched, went rigid. The decay left him. It tore free from his quirk factor like a bandage being ripped off a wound, except the wound was his soul, and the bandage was everything he had ever been. Twice felt it next. The duplication. The ability to make copies, to multiply, to be an army of one. Gone. Torn out and pulled skyward in a column of light that felt like being unmade from the inside. Spinner. Mr. Compress. Every member of the League present in that building, their quirks, their life force, the energy that kept their hearts beating, all of it pulled upward in a single catastrophic event that lasted 3 seconds. When the light faded, the building was still standing. The structure was undamaged. But the people inside, what remained of them, lay on the floor with their eyes open and their bodies empty. Alive, technically. Breathing. Technically. But the light behind their eyes was gone. The power that defined them was gone. The souls that animated them had been stripped of everything that made them anything more than flesh. Shigaraki's last coherent thought, before the pulling took his awareness, was that he had never understood what real power looked like until the moment it took everything from him. The League of Villains ceased to exist in 3 seconds. Everything they carried, every quirk, every fragment of potential, every ounce of power that All for One had invested in them, returned to Izuku. It flowed back into his soul and added to what was already an incomprehensible total. The hero world received the news as a mystery. The League of Villains, a credible threat, a prioritized target, an organization that had consumed significant investigative resources, simply stopped existing. Their last known location contained empty bodies, no signs of combat, no evidence of intrusion, no explanation that fit within any framework the investigators possessed. The file remained open, the analysts debated, and the public, already frightened by the UA incident, already watching a world they thought was safe prove otherwise, grew more afraid. There's nothing left of them, the lead investigator told the commission. We found bodies, they're alive, heart rates, brain activity, everything's there. But when you look at them, when you actually look at their eyes, there's nothing home. Whatever made them who they were is just gone. The word that spread through the underground was simpler. The League pissed off the Emperor. The League doesn't exist anymore. Don't piss off the Emperor. Fear. Genuine structural fear, the kind that changes behavior rather than just inspiring caution, settled over Japan's power structures like a weather pattern. Heroes felt it. Villains felt it. The government felt it. The commission felt it. And in the Silburn, Izuku sat on his throne and observed the futures branching forward. He had taken All for One's accumulated power. He had reclaimed the fragments invested in the League. His own strength had grown so far beyond any measurement this world could produce that the concept of quantification no longer applied. But the system still stood. The Hero Public Safety Commission still operated. The hero agencies still deployed patrols. The symbols still stood in their towers, maintaining the lie that the world was protected by their presence. That was next. 3 months after the UA incident, the Hero Public Safety Commission headquarters, a fortified complex in central Tokyo, housing the administrative and strategic core of Japan's entire hero system. From this building, decisions were made that affected every hero in the country. Rankings were determined. Resources were allocated. Threats were assessed and responses were organized. It was the heart of the system. The throne room of the Lee Izuku intended to end. He gave his forces their orders on a morning that the meteorological service had predicted would be clear and warm. 43 Sternritter, each carrying a letter, each transformed beyond what the hero world understood as possible. They moved into position through shadow gates, emerging in the districts surrounding the commission headquarters in coordinated arrival that placed them at every exit, every approach, and every defensive position simultaneously. The heroes were waiting. Of course they were. 3 months of escalating incidents had forced the commission to consolidate their strongest assets around their most critical location. The response was everything the hero world could muster. Endeavor stood at the primary entrance. Full output. His flames burning at maximum. The heat distortion visible from 3 blocks away. Beside him, Hawks. Fastest hero in Japan, feather blades deployed in a radius that covered the entire approach. Behind them, Mirko, the rabbit hero, her legs coiled and ready, her combat instinct screaming at a level she hadn't felt since her debut. And inside the building, at the center of the final defensive line, All Might, Toshinori Yagi, retired, diminished. The last ember of One for All burning in a body that was barely holding together. But present, because this was the moment. This was where the symbol of peace made his stand. Even if the stand killed him, Izuku arrived last. He stepped out of a shadow at the far end of the main boulevard leading to the commission headquarters. The Sternritter were already engaged. White-clad figures meeting heroes in combat across the district, the sounds of impact and energy discharge filling the morning air. But when Izuku appeared, everything paused. The spiritual pressure expanded. Slowly at first, a creeping weight that heroes on the perimeter felt in their lungs before they felt it in their quirks. Then, faster, heavier. The air compressed. The ground vibrated at a frequency that rattled teeth and loosened joints. Heroes on the outer perimeter, sidekicks, B-listers, support personnel, went down first. Their quirks sputtered and died. Their bodies hit the ground under a weight they couldn't see, couldn't understand, couldn't resist. 30 heroes dropped in the first wave. Then 50. Then the count stopped mattering because everyone below a certain threshold was simply removed from the fight by proximity alone. Izuku walked forward. Endeavor stepped into his path. The number one hero, because that's what he was now, by default, by absence of anything above him, stood in the center of the boulevard with his flames at maximum output. The heat around him warped the air. The asphalt beneath his feet was melting. He was fury incarnate, a man who had spent his entire life chasing a rival and now faced something that made that rival look reasonable. "I don't know what you are," Endeavor said. His voice was steady. His flames were steady. Everything about him was maximum output held in perfect form. "But you're going through me." Izuku looked at him. He saw the futures. He saw every attack Endeavor could produce. The prominence burn, the hell spider, the vanishing fist. He saw the trajectories, the timings, the maximal outputs. All of it laid bare before him like a diagram. "Your son already tried his best against me," Izuku said. "He inherited your limitations along with your power. I see both of you have the same ceiling." Endeavor launched Prominence Burn, the most destructive technique in his arsenal. A concentrated stream of fire hot enough to melt reinforced steel sustained at maximum output, aimed directly at the figure in white walking toward him. The fire reached Izuku. It washed over him. It surrounded him. 2,500 degrees of concentrated thermal energy. Endeavor's lifetime achievement, his signature technique, the move that had earned his rank. Izuku didn't activate Blutvena. He didn't need to. He stood in the fire and let it pass over him the way a mountain lets wind pass over it, aware of the contact, unaffected by the force. The flames licked his coat and found nothing to burn. They pressed against his skin and found nothing to damage. He kept walking forward, through the fire, toward Endeavor. The number one hero watched his ultimate technique fail in real time. He pushed harder, more output, more heat, everything he had left in the tank. His body was redlining. The warning signs his quirk sent him, the ones that said stop or you'll burn yourself out, were screaming. Izuku emerged from the prominence burn 3 meters from Endeavor. He reached out, one hand, open-palmed, pressed flat against Endeavor's chest. The spiritual pressure focused, a pulse, concentrated, directed, overwhelming, hit Endeavor like a train. His flames extinguished. His body left the ground. He flew backward 30 meters and hit the facade of a building hard enough to embed himself in the concrete. He stayed there, conscious, aware, but unable to make his limbs respond. One touch. The number one hero, removed from the fight. Conscious enough to watch what happened next and unable to do a single thing about it. Hawks moved before Endeavor landed. Speed. Hawks operated on speed the way other heroes operated on strength. His feather blades deployed in a pattern designed for maximum coverage, hundreds of them, approaching from every angle simultaneously, each one capable of cutting through steel, all of them converging on a single point. Izuku saw every feather's path before Hawks released them. Every angle, every timing, every possible configuration of the attack. Die Allmacht rendered it harmless before it began. The feathers reached the space where Izuku stood. They passed through air, every single one. Hundreds of blades, each on a trajectory that should have intersected his body, sailed through empty space and embedded themselves in the ground and walls behind him. Hawks froze midair. His wings spread wide, allowing him to hover, trembled. He had never missed. In his entire career, never. His feather control was the foundation of his hero identity, the precision that made him the fastest responder in Japan every feather had missed. "You move at the speed your wings allow," Izuku said, looking up at the hovering hero. "I move at the speed of inevitability. The gap between those things is wider than you can perceive." Hawks tried to reposition. His wings beat once, twice, and then stopped. The air around him thickened. The spiritual pressure focused on his position specifically, pressing down on him with targeted force that overwhelmed his wings' lifting capacity. He fell. He hit the ground hard enough to crack the asphalt and lay there gasping, his wings spread limp beneath him, his feathers scattered in a radius that told the story of a failed attack. Mirko didn't hesitate. She launched from her position with legs that could propel her through multiple reinforced walls in succession. Her approach was a straight line. No arcs, no telegraphing. She was the fastest physical combatant in the hero roster, and she moved with the intent of someone who understood that this was everything or nothing. Her leg hit Izuku's forearm bluntfini. The impact, enough force to split a building foundation, met spiritual armor that existed beyond material hardness. The sound was wrong. It should have been a crash, a crack, something indicating force meeting force. Instead, it was silence. Her leg stopped against his forearm and the kinetic energy simply ceased, absorbed, negated, rendered meaningless. The recoil traveled up her leg. The bones held. Her body was built for this kind of stress. But her expression, the moment she felt her maximum power strike accomplish absolutely nothing against a teenager's raised arm, told the whole story. She pulled back. She launched again. Different angle. More force. Everything she had, every fiber of every muscle in both legs firing in concert to produce a kick that would have registered on seismographs. Izuku caught her ankle. His hand closed around it mid-strike. Her entire momentum, hundreds of kilometers per hour, thousands of newtons of force, stopped dead. He held her there, leg extended, body suspended in the air, for a long moment. Then he threw her. Casually. The way a person tosses a ball to a child, she flew 30 meters and hit the ground in a roll that she barely controlled, her body gouging a trench in the asphalt before she stopped. She tried to stand. Her leg, the one he caught, trembled. Something in the ankle was wrong. The bones weren't broken, but the joint refused to work properly. She had felt something when he gripped her, something that went deeper than physical force, something that had reached into the mechanism of her body and told it, "That's enough." 3 of the strongest heroes Japan had to offer. The number 1, the fastest, the most physically powerful. All of them removed from the fight in under 60 seconds. Izuku walked past their fallen bodies and approached the entrance to the commission headquarters. Inside, behind the final defensive line, Toshinori Yagi stood up. He shouldn't have been there. He was retired. His body, emaciated, damaged, sustained by the lingering ember of a power that had been passed on to a successor who was still learning to carry it. He had maybe 1 attack left in him. Maybe less, but he was all might. He was the symbol of peace. And the world he had spent his entire career protecting was falling apart in front of him, and every hero who had carried the weight after his retirement was on the ground outside. He walked to the entrance. He pushed open the doors. He stepped into the boulevard and faced the figure in white approaching from the other end. "That's far enough, young man." His voice. Even now, even in this emaciated, barely functional body, his voice still carried the echo of what he had been. The authority. The hope, the promise that someone was standing between the world and whatever wanted to hurt it. Izuku stopped. He looked at All Might, at Toshinori Yagi, at the skeletal frame wearing the ghost of what had once been the most powerful hero in human history. "The symbol of peace," Izuku said. "Reduced to this. A memory wearing a body it can barely operate. You represent everything wrong with the system I am ending. A single point of failure around which an entire civilization organized its sense of safety. And when that point failed, as every single thing must eventually fail, the world you left behind had nothing beneath it." All Might's fist clenched. His body swelled. The transformation, the last remnants of One for All pushing his form toward what it used to be. Muscles inflated, his frame expanded. His smile, that smile, the one that told the world everything would be fine, appeared on his face. But it was wrong. It was desperate. It was a man trying to wear a costume that didn't fit anymore, pushing a body past its limits for one final act. "I am still here," All Might said. His voice was strong, the last strength he would ever produce, making it ring across the boulevard. "I am still standing, and as long as I am standing, as long as there is one hero left who will stand, your empire means nothing." Izuku watched the transformation complete. He watched All Might's body reach its maximum, a fraction of what it had been at peak, but still immense, still powerful, still carrying the weight of everything the symbol of peace meant to the world. You believe one decisive act of will can change the direction of history, Izuku said. That belief is the foundation of your heroism. It is also the flaw that I will now demonstrate. All Might moved, United States of Smash, everything. Every remaining ounce of One for All. Every fiber of his deteriorating body. Every fragment of hope and duty and love and sacrifice that had defined Toshinori Yagi's life. All of it compressed into a single punch aimed at the enemy standing in front of him. His right arm, wound back. His muscles fired. The air around his fist compressed and then shattered outward as the punch launched with force enough to change weather patterns. Izuku looked into the future where that punch landed. He reached into that timeline, reached across the boundary between now and then, and broke the arm. In the present, All Might's right arm snapped mid-swing. The sound was wet and wrong, bones separating from each other at the elbow, the muscles tearing from their anchoring points, the joint failing in 3 places simultaneously. His arm, extended, aimed, carrying everything he had, went limp midway through the motion. The United States of Smash died before it was born. All Might's face shifted. The smile vanished. Pain, genuine, overwhelming, structural, replaced it. He looked at his arm. It hung at an angle that human anatomy was never designed to produce. The transformation failed. His body shrunk. The muscle deflated. He was Toshinori Yagi again, thin, broken, bleeding from the arm, standing in the boulevard with nothing left. He fell to his knees. The world watched. Cameras inside the commission building, broadcasting to every network, captured All Might hitting the ground, captured the arm hanging wrong, captured the smile dying on his face. Izuku stood over him. "You built a world that relied on your existence," Izuku said. His voice was steady, absolute, the voice of someone delivering a verdict that had been decided before the trial began. "You carried the weight of an entire civilization's safety on a body that was always going to break. And when you broke, when the inevitable happened, the world you left behind was weaker than if you had never existed at all." All Might looked up at him. Blood ran from his arm. His body trembled. But his eyes, even now, even at the absolute bottom of everything, his eyes still held something. Defiance, belief, the unbreakable kernel of what made Toshinori Yagi who he was. The world will keep fighting, without me, after me. There are heroes on the ground outside this building, Izuku said. Endeavor, Hawks, Mirko, every hero your commission could summon. They are all behind me. They are all on the ground. And the students you were training to replace them watched me dismantle their school 3 months ago. He knelt. Eye level with All Might. Close enough that the former symbol of peace could see the layered pupils in Izuku's eyes, the cascading depths, the vision that saw everything and had already decided how everything ended. Your peace was a lie born from the fear of death. You stood as a symbol, and the people beneath you stopped growing because they believed you would always be there. When you fell, they had nothing. Your legacy is a generation of dependent, frightened, unprepared humans who were never allowed to face reality because you stood between them and it. He straightened. I will strip this world of fear, of progress, of life itself, the cycle that produces heroes and villains and victims in equal measure. I will build a world without suffering, without the struggle that creates conflict, without the death that gives urgency to war. I offer what you never could, permanence, absolute, eternal stillness. A world without death is a world without suffering. That is liberation. That is my gift. All Might's eyes widened. You're talking about. I am talking about the end of the world as you understand it, and the beginning of what comes after. Izuku stood fully. He turned toward the commission building. Your role in this story is complete. You are the last symbol of what was. You are the proof that it was insufficient. He walked toward the building. Behind him, All Might tried to rise. His body failed, his legs wouldn't hold. He fell back to the ground and lay there watching the figure in white walk away from him. For the first time in his life, in his entire career as the symbol of peace, through injuries that should have killed him, through losses that would have broken lesser men, through a secret that had eaten him alive for years, Toshinori Yagi felt helpless, and the cameras were still rolling. 58 million people watched All Might fall. 58 million people watched the symbol of peace try to throw his final punch and have his arm broken before the motion completed. 58 million people watched a figure in white give a speech about the failure of everything they had been taught to believe in. Social media didn't crash, it transcended crashing. The volume of simultaneous responses exceeded what the platform's servers could categorize, resulting in feeds that displayed information in wrong orders, threads that duplicated themselves, timelines that merged. The clip of All Might's arm breaking, the sound, the angle, the way his face changed, was viewed 900 million times in the first 24 hours. 900 million people watched the defining hero of their generation fail to throw a punch. The clip of Izuku's speech played on loop on every news network for 3 days straight. Analysts, commentators, philosophers, politicians. Everyone with a platform tried to respond to what he said, and every response sounded small compared to the original statement. In Class 1A's emergency shelter, because UA had been placed on full lockdown the moment the commission battle began, 32 students watched on a screen. Ochako Uraraka was crying. She had wanted to be a hero since she was 6 years old. She had worked harder than anyone she knew to get into UA. She had believed, genuinely, completely believed, that becoming a hero meant she could help people, could protect them, could make the world safer. And she had just watched every hero she admired get broken by one person who was her age. One person who had declared that everything she believed in was a lie and demonstrated, with undeniable broadcast to the world proof that the people defending that belief couldn't stop him. Tenya Ida stood behind the group, his back rigid, his arms at his sides, his brother, his family's legacy. The entire Ida lineage, built on heroism, built on speed, built on the belief that showing up first meant you could change the outcome. He watched the fastest hero in Japan fall from the sky with his wings dead and his feathers scattered, and he felt the foundation of his identity crack. Shoto Todoroki watched his father embed himself in a wall from a single palm strike. He watched the man who had spent 20 years trying to be the strongest hero in Japan removed from a fight in under 5 seconds. He felt something complicated, something that existed in the space between relief and horror. Katsuki Bakugo watched with his jaw clenched so hard his teeth cracked. His right arm, the one that had seized at UA, the one that had refused to obey him, still ached on cold mornings, a phantom pain with no physical source. He watched the broadcast and he said nothing, and his palms produced no sparks because even his quirk seemed reluctant to respond in the proximity of what was happening on screen. Momo Yaoyorozu, ranked first in intelligence among the first years, ran calculations in her head. Speed of the encounter, duration of each hero's engagement, time between Izuku's arrival and each hero's defeat. The numbers told a story so overwhelming that her analytical mind shut down halfway through processing it. "He didn't try," she said. Her voice was small. "Against any of them. He was never trying." Nobody responded. Because she was right, and everyone in the room could see it, and acknowledging it out loud felt like admitting something that couldn't be taken back. Izuku entered the commission building alone. The Stern Ritter had cleared the exterior. Heroes who had stood guard outside, dozens of them, varying in rank from sidekick to mid-tier pro, were on the ground, defeated, suppressed, rendered powerless by spiritual pressure and superior force, none dead. Izuku had given the order, incapacitate, do not kill. The dead returned nothing useful to him. Inside the building, the staff had evacuated to emergency bunkers. Security systems were in full lockdown. The building's defensive measures, suppression fields, quirk dampening technology, automated countermeasures, activated in sequence as Izuku moved through the corridors. None of it mattered. The suppression fields found nothing in him to suppress. The dampening technology targeted quirk factors that he didn't have. The automated countermeasures, turrets, energy barriers, lockdown protocols, activated and were destroyed casually. A Hylic file through each turret, a palm pressed against each barrier until it shattered. Lockdown doors torn from their hinges by Blute artery without breaking stride. He reached the central operations room, the nerve center of Japan's hero system. From this room, every hero deployment was coordinated. Every threat response was organized. Every piece of information that the system relied on flowed through the servers housed beneath the floor. Izuku stood in the center of the room. Screens surrounded him, each one showing different feeds from different cities, different heroes, different ongoing situations that the Commission managed simultaneously. The scope of it, the vast, complex, interconnected web of heroism that had been built over decades, was visible in this room as clearly as a diagram. He raised his hand. Reishi manifested. Blue-white energy condensed from particles in the air, spiritual matter pulled from the environment and shaped by his will into something new. It took the form of a blade, a long, straight blade of condensed spiritual energy that hummed at a frequency the building's structure resonated with. He drove it into the floor. The blade went through the reinforced concrete, through the server room beneath, through the data cores and communication hubs, and the physical infrastructure that connected this building to every hero agency in Japan. And then, something changed. The energy, concentrated at the blade's tip, buried deep in the foundation of the building, expanded outward. It moved through the ground like roots, spreading in every direction, reaching outward in patterns that followed ley lines that no human instrument could detect. The spiritual pressure, already immense, spiked to a level that sensors across the country registered as a new reading. Something fundamental shifted. It wasn't visible. It wasn't immediately tangible. But across Japan, in every city, every district, every region where quirk users existed, something in the air changed. The spiritual density of the environment increased by a factor that existing technology couldn't measure. The boundary between the physical world and whatever existed beneath it, the layer where souls resided, where spiritual energy flowed, thinned. Izuku was restructuring the operating system of reality. The effects manifested slowly at first. Heroes in the field reported quirk fluctuations, abilities that strengthened unpredictably or weakened without warning or manifested secondary effects that had never appeared before. Hospitals reported patients whose conditions changed overnight, stable cases destabilizing, terminal cases showing impossible improvement. The weather shifted in regions where no meteorological cause could be identified. The world was adjusting, adapting, responding to the change being written into its foundation by a hand that understood the code better than anything that had ever read it. Izuku stood in the operations room as the energy flowed outward from his blade. He watched the screens, each one flickering as the systems tried to process data that their frameworks were never built to accommodate. One by one, the feeds cut to static. One by one, the systems that connected this room to the outside world failed. The Hero Public Safety Commission ceased to function. The heart of the Hero system, its coordination, its communication, its ability to deploy and respond and organize, went silent. And across Japan, in every city and every district, people felt something change. They couldn't name it, they couldn't identify its source, but the air felt different, heavier, denser, like something that had always been thin and imperceptible had suddenly thickened to the point of awareness. Izuku withdrew the blade. It dissipated, Reishi releasing back into the air from which it was drawn. He turned and walked out of the operations room, past the destroyed security systems, through the corridors of a building that would never function again, toward the exit where his stern ritter waited. Outside, the boulevard was still. The heroes on the ground were being collected by medical teams that the stern ritter allowed to approach. Endeavor was conscious, embedded in his wall, his flames dead, his body unresponsive. Hawks lay where he had fallen, his wings spread beneath him, his feathers scattered. Mirko was sitting against a car, her leg extended, her expression carrying something between fury and forced acceptance. All Might was still on the ground. Someone had draped a blanket over him. His arm was being set by a paramedic who worked with shaking hands. Izuku emerged from the building and the boulevard went silent again. Every head turned. Every eye that could still focus locked on the figure in white stepping into the morning light. He looked at the cameras. They were still rolling. They had been rolling through all of it. The world was still watching. "What I have done today cannot be undone," he said. His voice carried across the boulevard with the same effortless projection it always did. "The change I have introduced into this world's foundation is permanent. Your quirks, the abilities you have relied on, built your identities around, organized your civilization upon, are now subject to rules that I write. He looked at All Might, at the blanket-wrapped figure on the ground who had tried to throw one last punch and had that possibility taken from him before his muscles could fire. Your hero system relied on stability. I have removed that stability. Your rankings relied on consistent power measurements. Those measurements will cease to hold meaning. The world you knew, the one where power was predictable and hierarchy was fixed, is over. He turned his gaze to the cameras one final time. I offer the world a choice. Accept what comes next. The restructuring, the dissolution of the false peace, the building of something permanent and whole, or resist. Both paths lead to the same destination. One of them involves significantly less suffering. He stepped into his own shadow and vanished. The stern Ritter withdrew simultaneously. 43 figures in white disappearing from the district in the same instant, stepping into shadows or passing through dimensional tiers or simply ceasing to be visible. The battle, if it could be called that, was over. The aftermath was silence, then sirens, then screaming. Then the news networks cutting to their studio anchors who sat behind desks and tried to contextualize what had just been broadcast to the entire nation. They couldn't, because there was no context for this. There was no framework, there was no precedent or comparison or historical parallel that could make what had just happened comprehensible. The world had watched its strongest heroes fall. The world had watched its defensive infrastructure get dismantled. The world had watched a 15-year-old boy declare the end of everything they understood about power, about safety, about the basic operating principles of reality, and the world had felt the change he described. Every person with a quirk in Japan, 80% of the population, felt it in their bones. Something was different. Something had shifted beneath them like a tectonic plate moving in a direction no one expected. The era of heroes was over. What came next had already been decided by someone who had seen every possible future and chosen the one he wanted. 3 days after the commission fell, Izuku Midoriya received a visitor. She was in her apartment. The same apartment. The television was on. It had been on continuously since the UA incident, playing every report, every analysis, every piece of footage that featured her son. The apartment was a shrine to vigil. Unwashed dishes. Unopened mail. The life of a woman who had stopped living for herself the moment her child walked out the door 11 years ago. The knock came at 7 in the evening. She answered it expecting police, expecting reporters, expecting one of the dozen agencies that had been calling her daily for comments and statements and psychological profiles of a child they were trying to understand. Toga stood in the hallway, wearing Inko's face. It took Inko 4 seconds to process what she was seeing. Her own face, her own features, her own body type and hair color and expression standing in her hallway, looking at her with eyes that were hers and also absolutely were hers. "Hello," Toga's Inko said. Her voice was perfect, identical. "He wanted you to have this." She extended an envelope, white paper, no address, no stamp, no marking. Inko's hands shook as she took it. Who are you? Why do you? My face. I'm a friend." Toga smiled with Inko's mouth. "Read the letter." He wrote it himself. "I'll wait if you have questions." Inko opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside, a single sheet of paper, handwritten. The handwriting was precise and steady in a way that suggested the hand producing it had never hesitated over a single stroke. She read, "Mother. I remember the 4 years of silence. I remember your voice reading to me. I remember the warmth of your hands when you changed my clothes and the rhythm of your heart when you pressed your ear against my chest. I was aware of all of it. I was aware of you. I left because what I am required more than what that apartment could contain. The world you raised me in, the world of heroes and villains and measured power, is a system I intend to replace with something permanent. Something that does not require suffering to function. You will understand what I am building when it is complete. Until then, you are protected. My soldiers stand at your borders. My awareness covers your location at all times. You will come to no harm. This is the only promise I make, and I have never broken a promise. I do not ask for your understanding. I do not ask for your approval. I ask only that you continue to exist in the world I am building, because the version of that world where you are present is the version I have chosen, your son. Inko's legs gave out. She slid down the doorframe until she sat on the floor, the letter pressed against her chest, tears running down her face in streams she made no effort to stop. Toga, still wearing Inko's face, knelt beside her. He's real, you know, under all of it. Under the power and the soldiers and the speeches. There's a version of him that remembers being your kid. He's bigger than that now. Bigger than anything that fits in a regular-sized life. Inko looked at her own face through blurred vision. Is he happy? Toga thought about it. Actually thought about it. I don't think happy is a word that applies to him. He's complete. He knows exactly what he is and exactly what he's doing, and there's zero gap between those two things. Most people spend their whole lives trying to figure out their purpose. He was born already knowing. Inko pressed the letter harder against her chest. Tell him he already knows. Toga stood. She shifted, her form rippling, Inko's features melting away to reveal the sharp-toothed, yellow-eyed girl beneath. He knows everything. That's kind of his whole deal. She left. The hallway door closed. Inko sat on her apartment floor and cried until the sun went down, holding a letter from a son she had lost and found and lost again in forms she could never have prepared for. The world adjusted. Slowly, painfully, with the grinding resistance of an entire civilization being forced to acknowledge that the fundamental rules it operated under had been rewritten, hero agencies attempted to resume operations. They found their coordination systems offline, permanently. The Commission's centralized communication network, the backbone of organized hero response, was irreparable. The physical hardware was functional. The software was intact. But the system simply refused to connect to the network it had always operated on, as if the network itself had been erased from the electromagnetic spectrum. Heroes operated independently, without coordination, without ranking updates, without the support structure that had allowed them to function as an organized force. Each agency became an island, communicating through phone calls and text messages like civilians, responding to incidents through observation rather than dispatch. Crime shifted. The criminal underground, already 80% absorbed into the Wandenreich, operated with an efficiency that made the hero system look primitive by comparison. Sternritter appeared in areas where crime had previously run unchecked and established order through overwhelming superiority. Districts that hero patrols had abandoned years ago found themselves under protection that was more effective, more present, and more absolute than anything heroes had ever provided. The public noticed. They had been told for decades that heroes were the wall between them and danger. Now they watched that wall crumble and something else take its place. Something that wore white instead of costumes. Something that operated without cameras or rankings or public relations. Something that was simply present. Powerful, effective, and undeniable. Support for the hero system didn't collapse overnight, but it eroded. Daily, as people in dangerous neighborhoods watched Sternritter stop crimes that hero patrols had never reached. As families in disaster-prone areas found white-clad figures arriving before emergency services. As the gap between what heroes promised and what the Wandenreich delivered became impossible to ignore, Izuku sat on his throne and watched the futures branch. Every timeline he observed showed the same thing. The erosion continuing, the system failing, the world reorganizing itself around the new center of gravity he had established. Some timelines showed resistance, some showed acceptance. All of them showed the same destination he had already won. The battle at the Commission was the moment the outcome became fixed. Everything that followed was a process, like water finding its level, like a building settling into its foundation. The world was adjusting to him, learning to orbit around him, accepting that the strongest force in existence had declared itself and everything else would have to accommodate that reality. Tuya stood at his right hand, Toga at his left. The Sternritter arrayed behind them, 43 soldiers, each carrying a fragment of his soul, each connected to him in a way that transcended physical proximity. The hero schools are still operating, Tuya reported. UA, Shiketsu, the smaller academies. They're training students in response to what happened, trying to produce something that can oppose us. Let them, Izuku said. Every student they train will eventually face the same choice every other powered individual in this country faces. Join willingly or be rendered irrelevant. Training accelerates that choice. It does not change the options. Hawks is alive, Toga added. He's organizing something. Off-grid, using personal networks instead of commission channels. A resistance. Maybe. I have seen it, Izuku said. I have seen every version of it. It fails in all of them. The question is only how quickly it fails and how much suffering occurs before the failure is acknowledged. Should we stop it now? Tuya's hand raised, blue-white flames dancing between his fingers, eager. Let it grow. Izuku's expression was absolute. A resistance that forms in secret and is crushed in public teaches more than a resistance that never forms at all. The lesson requires an audience. Let them build something they believe in, then let the world watch it fail. Tuya smiled. It was the smile of someone who had spent years in pain and now stood pain-free in the service of a being who had never lied to him. You're terrifying, you know that? I am Thoreau, Izuku corrected. Terror is a byproduct. Toga laughed. The sound echoed in the white stone chamber, bright and genuine and slightly unhinged, the way everything about Toga existed slightly left of center. I love working here. Best job I ever had. The Silburn hummed around them. The spiritual energy pulsing through its walls matched Izuku's heartbeat. Steady, absolute, inevitable. The palace existed in a space between dimensions, unreachable by any force the hero world could produce. From here, Izuku watched the world reorganize itself. From here, he directed the Sternritter in their expansion. From here, the future. Every version of it he wanted to keep. Unfolded exactly as he had already decided it would. Somewhere on the surface, heroes trained. Students studied. Resistance formed in whispered conversations and encrypted messages. The world that had existed before Izuku's declaration tried to hold itself together through will and memory, and the desperate belief that something, anything, could be done. They were wrong. They would learn they were wrong. And when they learned it, the world after that lesson would belong entirely to the boy who sat on a white throne and saw every possible future and had already chosen which one would exist. The new era was here. The father of the new empire sat at its center, patient and absolute, and the world turned around him the way everything turns around the strongest force in its vicinity. Helplessly, completely, and with the growing understanding that resistance was simply delayed acceptance, the resistance assembled in a dice-used naval facility 40 kilometers off the coast of Yokohama, a concrete bunker sunk into a cliff face that the Maritime Self-Defense Force had decommissioned 8 years prior and forgotten existed. Hawks chose it because its communication systems ran on hardline copper rather than digital networks, because its walls were reinforced against quirk-based detection, and because the ocean between it and the mainland created a buffer zone, and his instincts told him mattered, even if his logic couldn't explain why. 3 months of work lived inside those walls. Encrypted channels built on personal trust rather than institutional access. 41 heroes who survived the commission battle or arrived in its aftermath. Some of them operating at reduced capacity, some of them carrying injuries that would end their careers in a world that still ranked them. 12 students from UA's combined hero courses, smuggled out of lockdown by faculty, who understood that what was coming would require everyone. 7 government officials who still commanded resource channels, military logistics, satellite access, emergency funding that bypassed parliamentary oversight. Hawk stood at the front of the briefing room. His wings were healed barely. The feathers had regrown in uneven patterns, some longer than others, giving him an asymmetric silhouette that he hated looking at in mirrors. His speed was at 70%. His precision was at 80. He would never be what he was before the commission fell, and he had made peace with that 3 weeks into recovery. The dimensional fold that houses his palace exists in a space our instruments can detect, but our technology fails to penetrate, he said. The holographic display behind him showed energy readings taken from 6 separate monitoring stations over 90 days. The boundary fluctuates. Twice a day, at 1100 and 2300 hours, the energy signature weakens by approximately 4%. Our quirk interference specialists believe that window allows physical entry. Mirko was leaning against the far wall, her repaired leg extended in front of her. The joint worked again. Physical therapy and 3 healing quirk users had rebuilt the damaged tissue, but she walked with a hitch she would carry forever. Her face held something it had never held during her career. Patience born from having been thrown 30 meters by a teenager who caught her ankle like a tossed coin. 4%, she said. That's our window. That's our window. Hawks confirmed it without optimism. He delivered facts. He had stopped trading in hope the day he watched every feather he launched miss a single target. Endeavor occupied the back row. His burns had healed wrong, the skin on his left shoulder carrying a texture that his fire couldn't smooth out, a reminder of the wall he'd been driven into at the commission. His output was diminished, 58% of peak. His body could still produce temperatures that melted steel, but the ceiling he'd operated at for decades was gone. Somewhere between the palm strike that drove him through concrete and the 3 months of recovery that followed, the man who spent 40 years chasing the #1 rank had arrived at an understanding about limits that he'd spent his entire career refusing to acknowledge. He said nothing during briefings. He attended every one. He trained every morning. He pushed his diminished output against its new boundaries with the same relentless grinding he'd always applied to everything. But the speeches, the demands for action, the fury that had defined his engagement with authority, those were absent. Something had been spent at the commission that hadn't regenerated with the rest of him. The plan Hawks built was comprehensive. Multiple entry vectors, quirk interference devices designed to disrupt spiritual energy patterns. Experimental, untested against their actual target, but theoretically sound based on the readings they'd gathered. Coordinated strike teams hitting the dimensional boundary from 3 locations simultaneously. Distraction operations on the mainland, drawing Sternritter away from the palace interior. It was good work. 3 months of a brilliant tactical mind applied to an impossible problem, producing the best possible answer within the constraints of reality. In the Silburn, Izuku watched it through eyes that saw every future branching from every decision Hawks had made. He sat on his throne. White stone. Blue light pulsing through the walls in the steady rhythm that matched his heartbeat. That had always matched his heartbeat. Since the day the palace formed from the raw spiritual energy, he pressed into the space between dimensions. He chose the naval facility because its communications run on copper, Izuku said. His voice filled the chamber the way it always did, without effort, without projection, occupying every corner of the space as if the air itself chose to carry it. He built entry vectors based on the 4% window at 2300 hours. He assigned Mirko to the primary breach team because her physical capabilities exceed the threshold for dimensional barrier penetration. Tuya stood at his right hand. His posture was loose, shoulders relaxed, hands at his sides, the complete physical ease of a man whose body had stopped being his enemy the day a soul fragment rebuilt every cell of it. Blue-white flames danced between his fingers in absent patterns, the way another person might fidget with a pen. Should we close the window? The window exists because I allow it to exist. Izuku's gaze remained fixed on something beyond the physical walls of the chamber, something only Dai Almacht could perceive. Futures layering over futures in cascading probability trees that extended past what human language could describe. A resistance that forms in hiding and is crushed in daylight teaches the world something a prevention never could. They need to try. The audience needs to watch them try, and the audience needs to see exactly what trying accomplishes against something that has already decided the outcome. Togo is at his left hand, perched on the arm of a stone chair with her legs folded beneath her. Her yellow eyes tracked Izuku's face with an attention that went beyond focus, something closer to devotion, wearing the shape of observation. "How long?" she asked. 3 days. They move in 3 days. Their timing is built around a satellite window that gives them 30 minutes of coverage darkness. Izuku stood. The spiritual pressure in the chamber shifted. A subtle increase that the Sternritter felt in their chests, the way people near the ocean feel changes in atmospheric pressure before storms arrive. Assign perimeter units to their mainland distraction targets. Allow engagement. Allow the appearance of success. The lesson requires them to believe they are winning before they learn they are failing. 43 fists hit 43 chests. The salute echoed through the Silburn like a drumbeat. The board was set. Every piece was in position. The only remaining variable was how much suffering the opposition chose to endure before accepting what had been decided since before the first meeting Hawks ever called. Shoto Todoroki had stopped sleeping through the night 2 weeks after the commission fell. It was the fire. In his dreams, the fire was always blue-white, the color his brother's flames had worn before the world declared Tuya Todoroki dead. The color he'd seen in news footage of Sternritter operations. The color that burned at temperatures his father's quirk would never reach, produced by a body that was whole and healthy in a way Tuya's body had never been during the years they shared a house. His brother was alive. His brother was whole. His brother served the being who had walked through their father's strongest technique without acknowledgement and broken the symbol of peace's arm before the punch completed. He was in a training room at the resistance facility, alone, 3 a.m, running his dual output through repetitions that had become meditative in the months since everything collapsed. Ice from the right, fire from the left, alternating, balancing, pushing the integration his father had spent 20 years trying to breed into existence. The message arrived through a channel none of Hawks' security should have allowed. A frequency that bypassed every encrypted layer and delivered its content directly to Shoto's communicator in text that glowed faintly blue on the screen. Shoto, Building 9, the East Dock. Come alone or bring anyone you want. It changes nothing. He went alone, because some things between brothers require absence of audience regardless of what tactical wisdom demands. Building 9 was a storage warehouse, empty, concrete-floored, open at one end to the ocean. The moonlight came through the loading dock in silver slabs that turned the interior into a landscape of illumination and shadow. Tuya stood at the center, white coat, blue flames dancing along his shoulders in lazy patterns that threw shifting light across the walls. His face, whole, unmarked, the skin smooth and healthy in a way Shoto had never seen on his brother in life, carried an expression that existed somewhere between invitation and warning. "You grew up," Tuya said. His voice was steady. The ragged edge it had carried in every memory Shoto held of him was gone, replaced by something settled, something that came from a chest that breathed without pain. "You look like the old man, but better. Less angry. You're alive." Shoto's voice came out flat. He'd practiced this moment in his head for months, what he would say, how he would carry himself. Every practice version had been wrong. More than alive. Tuya raised his hands. The flames climbed, spiraling upward in columns that reached the warehouse ceiling and spread across it like a canopy of blue-white light. "For the first time since the day I manifested, my body holds what it produces. My skin doesn't tear. My bones absorb the temperature instead of cracking under it. Everything the old man failed to build into me, he gave it to me. In 30 seconds. Shoto felt the heat. It pushed against him from 20 meters away, a wall of thermal energy that exceeded anything their father had ever produced in Shoto's presence. This was beyond Endeavor's output ceiling, beyond anything Shoto's dual nature could match. This was cremation fire evolved past its original form and housed in a vessel rebuilt to contain every degree. "Come with me." Tuya lowered his hands. The fire settled. His eyes, blue, clear, carrying the steady certainty of someone who had found their place in the world, met Shoto's across the warehouse floor. "He would take you. I know he would. Whatever the old man built you to be, he can make you into what you were supposed to be, without the pain. Without the breeding program and the abuse and the years of being a project instead of a person. I am a hero." Shoto said it the way someone says something they've been holding on to because releasing it would mean falling. "You are a weapon that a broken man pointed at his own insecurities." Tuya's voice carried weight without rising. A tool built by a father who measured his children by their utility. Every hour you spent training his techniques, every second you burned or froze in his presence, was investment in his ambition, wearing the disguise of education. That's the past. The past made you. And the future he's building, the one where power like ours serves something larger than a ranking system, that's where I found something worth being. Tuya stepped forward. One step. The heat followed him. I watched you on the broadcast. At UA, full output, both sides, everything you had, it broke against him like water against stone. You know what that means. You felt it. Shoto had felt it. 3 months of trying to forget what absolute inferiority felt like. The ice shattering, the fire accomplishing nothing, the figure in white standing in the aftermath without a hair, displaced. I will never serve him, Shoto said. Tuya's expression shifted. Something in it went cold while the rest stayed warm. Then I'm sorry for what happens next. Because you're going to fight me. You won't be able to help it. The hero in you requires it. And I have to show you what the gap looks like so you'll remember it when the choice comes around again. Shoto's ice manifested before the sentence finished. Instinct. A glacier's worth of frozen mass erupting from the concrete floor, rushing toward his brother at the speed of reflex. The same volume he'd thrown at Izuku at UA, the output his body produced when it felt genuine threat, Tuya walked through it. His heat melted the ice before contact. The thermal radius extending from his body turned Shoto's glacier to steam in a radius that expanded outward like a bubble. 3 meters, 5 meters, 8 meters of frozen mass converted to vapor by proximity alone. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't produce flame. His body temperature was simply too high for ice to exist near him. Shoto switched. Fire from the left, everything he had, the full output of his mother's ice, combined with his father's heat, channeled through a body that had trained both sides into integration. The flames roared across the warehouse in a wave that consumed the steam and turned the space between them into a corridor of pure thermal energy. Tuya stood in it the way Izuku had stood in their father's prominence burn, present, unbothered. His body was built to exist inside temperatures that exceeded what this world produced naturally. Shoto's fire, powerful, trained, genuine, washed over him and found nothing it could affect. Then Toya responded, one hand extended toward Shoto. The flames that erupted from his palm were a color Shoto had never seen fire produce, beyond blue-white, beyond the visible spectrum, registering in his vision as an absence rather than a presence. A hole in the light. The heat hit Shoto's ice wall, the barrier he'd erected between himself and the approaching flame, and the ice didn't melt. It evaporated. The phase between solid and liquid was skipped entirely. 12 tons of frozen mass went from ice to steam to plasma in a time interval that Shoto's perception registered as instantaneous. He threw up his right side. Maximum ice generation, the ceiling of his output, the wall between himself and destruction. It formed and vanished in the same heartbeat, vaporized by heat that laughed at everything the Todoroki bloodline could produce from either temperature extreme. Shoto felt the edge of that heat, just the edge, the thermal radiation extending past the plasma wave, reaching his skin. It burned. Through his cold resistance, through the ice side temperature regulation his body maintained, through every defense his dual nature provided. It burned him the way fire burned anyone else. He stumbled backward. His left arm was red. First-degree burn from thermal radiation alone, from the edge of the attack, from the fraction of output that leaked past the main blast. Tuya stood 30 meters away. His hand was lowered. The warehouse behind Shoto, the wall, the loading dock, the section of cliff face visible through the destroyed structure, glowed orange with residual heat. That was 20%, Tuya said. The words fell into the silence like stones into water. The Emperor rebuilt me to hold everything. And everything, Shoto, is more than the old man ever imagined when he decided to breed his perfect weapon. Shoto was on one knee. His burned arm trembled. His ice side was compensating, cold spreading across the damaged tissue, reducing swelling, managing pain. But the reality of what had just happened was heavier than the physical damage. His brother, whose body had been destroying itself since adolescence, whose quirk had been a prison sentence carried in his own genes, had just surpassed everything the Todoroki project was designed to produce, had surpassed it effortlessly, had done it at a fraction of maximum output while walking through Shoto's best attacks like they were ambient temperature. He fixed you, Shoto said. His voice was small. He completed me. Tuya walked toward his brother. His steps left glowing footprints on the concrete, the surface heated beyond tolerance by his baseline temperature. He stopped 3 meters from Shoto, close enough to touch. The old man built us wrong, on purpose. He knew what he was doing when he put fire in a body made of paper. He knew what would happen, and he did it anyway because the product mattered more than the person. Izuku looked at me and saw what I was supposed to be, and then he made me that. Shoto looked up at his brother. Through the pain in his arm and the collapse happening inside his chest, the understanding that everything his father had built, everything Shoto had trained, everything the Todoroki bloodline represented was irrelevant beside what one soul fragment from a 15-year-old god had accomplished in 30 seconds. "What does he want?" Shoto asked. "Everything." Tuya's answer was immediate. He wants everything, and he already has it. The question was never whether he gets it. The question is how much breaks before the world admits what he already knows. Tuya turned. He walked toward the destroyed loading dock, toward the ocean and the moonlight, and whatever shadow gate waited to return him to the Silburn. "The offer stays open," he said over his shoulder. "When you're ready. When the hero in you runs out of reasons to keep fighting something you already know you can't beat." He stepped into the shadow cast by a destroyed support beam and vanished. The warehouse held the heat of his presence for hours afterward, the concrete retaining temperatures that told the story of what had stood inside it. Shoto sat on the floor with his burned arm and the silence and the understanding that his brother had been gentle with him. That 20% of Tuya's output had been a kindness, a demonstration rather than a destruction. That the full power of what Izuku had built into the boy their father had broken would have left nothing of Shoto to carry the memory. He sat there until morning. He told no one what had happened. But the burn on his arm stayed visible for weeks, and every time Bakugo or Uraraka or anyone else at the Resistance looked at it, the question they wanted to ask died in their throats because the answer was already written on Shoto's face. The international response arrived 11 days after Tuya's visit, a combined force from 12 nations, the United States, the European Union's Consolidated Hero Registry, South Korea, Australia, Brazil, and 7 others who committed resources to the largest joint hero operation in recorded history. 3 aircraft carriers repurposed as mobile command platforms, 47 ranked heroes from various national rosters, support personnel numbering in the thousands, communication arrays operating on frequencies nowhere. Japan's destroyed infrastructure couldn't access. They anchored offshore. The operation was broadcast intentionally, strategically, because the nation's contributing forces wanted their populations to see strength being projected, to see that the international community would respond when one nation's hero system fell, to see that what happened to Japan would be contained and corrected by the combined will of the global hero order. Izuku watched through Die Allmacht as the fleet positioned itself. 47 heroes, 3 carriers, enough firepower, conventional and quirk-based, to level a small country. He told no one he was leaving. He stepped into a shadow in the Silburn's throne room and emerged on the bow of the lead carrier. The first people who saw him were 3 support technicians running diagnostics on a communication array. They registered the figure in white, the green hair, the white long coat, the face they had studied in briefing materials for a week. And the recognition hit them at the same moment the spiritual pressure did. They dropped. Their equipment dropped with them. The diagnostic screens cracked against the deck. The pressure expanded outward. It rolled across the carrier like a wave moving through the hull, invisible, irresistible. Personnel on the flight deck went down in clusters. The control tower staff hit their consoles. The engine room crew collapsed at their stations. 300 people on the lead carrier alone, unconscious or pinned in under 10 seconds. The heroes stationed on the flight deck were stronger. Their bodies, conditioned by quirk usage and professional combat, resisted the initial wave longer than untrained personnel. They had 14 seconds of consciousness. Some of them used that time to activate their abilities. Energy blasts launched toward the figure walking across the deck. Barriers manifested. One hero, an American with a kinetic absorption quirk, launched himself forward with everything his ability could produce. Izuku raised his hand. The spiritual pressure focused. What had been a general field became a directed force, aimed at the heroes on the deck, pushing against the specific biological mechanisms that generated their powers. Quirks failed. The energy blasts sputtered and died mid-flight. The barriers flickered and dissolved. The American hero hit the deck face first 10 meters from Izuku's position, his quirk going silent inside him like a light being turned off. The second and third carriers were broadcasting emergency signals. Their hero contingents, spread across the 3 vessels, attempted coordinated response. Teams launched from the adjacent ships via aircraft, via quirk-powered flight, via every rapid deployment method their nations had developed. They crossed the ocean between ships. They entered the radius of spiritual pressure extending from Izuku's position. They fell into the water. 47 heroes from 12 nations, the combined response of the international hero community, hit the ocean surface in the space of 30 seconds as their abilities failed and their bodies encountered a weight their training never prepared them for. Recovery boats launched, medical personnel scrambled, the fleet's coordinated response dissolved into chaos management as the heroes they'd sent as a show of force bobbed in the Pacific, conscious, alive, stripped of every power they'd brought with them. Izuku walked to the edge of the flight deck. He looked out at the ocean, at the other carriers, at the recovery operations, at the cameras. Every major international news network had positioned on observation vessels nearby. He raised his right hand. Sankt Bogan manifested above him, larger than it had ever appeared. The bow spanning 40 meters, its arms extending outward from his position like wings of concentrated blue-white energy. The spiritual particles in the air condensed around it, drawn to the weapon's formation the way iron filings orient toward a magnet. 5 arrows materialized against the string simultaneously, each one burned with contained power, dense enough to distort the air around them, bright enough that the cameras on observation vessels adjusted their exposure automatically. He drew. He released. The arrows crossed the distance between his position and their targets in a time interval that the human eye could not track. They struck the communication arrays on all 3 carriers. They struck the satellite uplinks. They struck the coordination systems that connected this fleet to the 11 nations watching from their capitals. Each impact was silent. Where the arrows hit, the targeted structures ceased to exist. Clean removal. The communication arrays, the satellite dishes, the server rooms that housed coordination software, all of it gone. Open air where hardware had been. The fleet was intact, the ships were undamaged, the people aboard were alive, but the ability to communicate, to coordinate, to function as anything other than 3 independent vessels floating without connection to each other or to home, that was removed. Izuku turned to face the cameras on the observation vessels. The international media, 36 networks from 22 countries, had their feeds pointed at the carrier deck. At the figure in white standing amid unconscious personnel, at the massive bow dissolving into particles of blue light above him. You crossed oceans to fix something you do not understand. His voice carried across the water to every microphone pointed in his direction. Return home. Tell your governments what you saw. Tell them the world has already changed, and the question is whether they arrive at what comes next with their dignity or without it. One hero had recovered enough to stand, a woman from the European roster, large frame, physical enhancement quirk, the kind of hero whose body was built to endure punishment that dropped everyone else. She rose from the deck 30 meters from Izuku's position. Her legs were shaking, her quirk was stuttering, active, then silent, then active again, fighting against the spiritual pressure like a flame-fighting wind. She charged, full speed, full force, everything her enhancement provided. Her fist, wrapped in the glow of her activated quirk, drove toward Izuku's back, Blut Veen. Her fist connected with his spine. The impact, enough to crack ship hulls, enough to leave craters in reinforced concrete, traveled through her arm and met something that existed beyond material hardness. Beyond density. Beyond any physical concept her quirk had ever encountered. The recoil was immediate. Her hand broke. 3 bones in her fist, 2 in her wrist, compound fractures that her enhancement quirk couldn't prevent because the force had nowhere to go except back through her own body. She staggered backward, cradling her destroyed hand, staring at the back that her strongest strike had affected the way a breeze affects a mountain. Izuku didn't turn around. He stepped off the edge of the carrier deck and fell into his own shadow before he reached the water. The fleet sat in silence. 47 heroes being pulled from the ocean, 3 carriers without communication systems. The combined international response, everything the world outside Japan could assemble, rendered inoperable in under 3 minutes by a single figure who never raised his voice. In Washington, the Joint Chiefs of Staff watched the footage from a Pentagon briefing room. The Secretary of Defense was present. The President had been informed. 14 people with the authority to deploy nuclear weapons sat around a conference table and watched their nation's strongest heroes fall into the Pacific Ocean from an invisible weight. Nobody spoke for 2 minutes after the feed cut to static. "What are our options?" the Secretary asked. The room produced no answer that any person present was willing to say out loud. In Brussels, the European Defense Council held an emergency session that lasted 9 hours and produced a single-page document recommending member states avoid further direct confrontation pending assessment of new strategic realities. The document used the word unprecedented 11 times. In Beijing, 3 senior military officials were dismissed from their positions for suggesting that what they'd witnessed on the feed was a fabrication designed to justify Japanese territorial expansion. They were dismissed because the satellite data from China's own observation platforms confirmed every reading the Japanese sensors had produced. The energy levels were real. The hero failures were real. The communication arrays had ceased to exist. The world's response to the international fleet's failure was the specific silence of powerful institutions, discovering simultaneously that their power was irrelevant. A silence made of rooms full of important people with nothing to say and nothing to do, and no framework for understanding why. Izuku returned to the Silburn and sat on his throne, and the world beyond his walls processed what it had witnessed the way a body processes a blow. Slowly, with pain, with the growing recognition that something fundamental had been damaged. On a Thursday evening, 3 months and 8 days after the commission fell, Izuku Midoriya was washing dishes. The television was on. It was always on. But the volume was low, and she'd stopped watching the screen with the desperate attention of those first weeks. The reports had become repetitive, analysts saying the same things in different words, heroes issuing statements that carried less conviction with each iteration, the world cycling through its limited vocabulary for what was happening and finding every word insufficient. The shadow in the corner of her kitchen shifted. She felt it before she saw it. A change in the weight of the air, a pressure against her chest that was familiar in a way her conscious mind couldn't identify, but her body recognized instantly. The same pressure she'd felt in the hallway 11 years ago when her arms went slack and her son walked free of her embrace. She turned. He was taller than she'd imagined, 6 feet, lean, the white coat she'd seen on broadcasts, the green hair, the same shade she saw in her own mirror every morning. His face was the face from the footage, but seeing it in person 3 meters away in her kitchen was something the screen hadn't prepared her for. His eyes. Those eyes with their layered depth, their cascading pupils when the power behind them activated. They looked at her and they held recognition, and they held something else, something the broadcasts never showed because cameras couldn't capture it. Attention. Full, complete, total attention, the awareness of a being who saw every future simultaneously, focused entirely on one woman standing at a kitchen sink with wet hands and a dish towel over her shoulder. Mom. His voice. A man's voice now, deeper than the child's voice from the footage, but carrying the same quality, that absolute certainty, that absence of performance. Except here, in this kitchen aimed at her, it sounded different, smaller, more human. Izuku. Her hands were shaking. Water dripped from her fingers onto the tile. You're here. You're really... Sit down. He pulled a chair from the kitchen table. He sat in the one across from it. His white coat settled around him like it was part of his body rather than something worn over it. I will answer everything you ask. I owe you that. She sat. Her legs gave out halfway through the motion, and the chair caught her. 11 years of questions lived behind her teeth. 11 years of silence and searching and watching her son on a screen being something she couldn't comprehend. Why? The first question, the only question, the one that contained every other question inside it. Because what I am requires more than a life lived inside 4 walls. He looked at her across the kitchen table, across the space where she'd eaten alone for over a decade, where she'd sat with her teacup watching footage of her son declaring war on civilization, war en foreseen. I carry the memory of something older than this world's concept of age. The body you gave birth to, the boy who lay still for 4 years, was integrating a soul that held dominion over the boundary between life and death in an existence prior to this one. When the integration completed, what remained was too large for the life I was born into. You were 4. Her voice cracked. You were 4 years old, and you walked out, and I couldn't. You couldn't hold me. The power I exerted to leave your arms was involuntary. I remember the weight of your grip. I remember choosing to break it. I remember that it cost me something I have never fully recovered. He said this with the same flat certainty. He said everything. But his hands, resting on the table, visible to her, were still. Deliberately still. The stillness of someone holding something in place. "Did you hear me?" she asked. "In those 4 years, did you hear anything?" "Everything." He looked at her, and his expression, the perpetual certainty, the absolute authority, softened by a degree so small that anyone who hadn't spent 4 years memorizing his sleeping face would have missed it. "You read me stories every night. Your voice carried a melody on certain words, words that excited you, descriptions you loved. You read me a book about a rabbit who lived on the moon, and you laughed at the same page every time because the illustration showed the rabbit wearing boots that were too large." Inko's breath left her. The rabbit book. She'd forgotten the rabbit book. She'd read it so many times during those 4 years that the pages had worn soft at the edges, and she'd eventually donated it to a library because keeping it after he vanished hurt more than she could bear. "The boots," she whispered. "The boots." He inclined his head, half a degree, an acknowledgement that carried more weight than a full bow from anyone else alive. "I heard every word. I was aware of your presence every moment you were in the room. The integration process required my consciousness to be directed inward, but your voice was the constant that oriented me within my own body. Without it, the process would have taken longer, possibly would have taken forever." Tears ran down her face. She made no attempt to stop them. "The world says you're a monster. The world is correct by its own definition of the word. I am rewriting the rules it operates under. From inside those rules, what I am doing resembles destruction. From outside, from the perspective of what comes after, it is construction. Are you going to kill people?" "I have given orders that prevent killing. The dead return nothing useful to me. Everything I build requires living vessels, people who can carry fragments of my soul and grow stronger within them. Death is waste. I collect. I do not destroy." She looked at him, at her son, at the god wearing her son's face. Except it wasn't wearing it, it was him. Both things simultaneously. The child who had lain in silence, hearing her voice, and the being who erased buildings and broke the arms of symbols and declared the end of everything the world believed in. Both of those things sat at her kitchen table and looked at her with eyes that saw every possible future and still chose to be here, in this room, answering her questions. "Do you love me?" she asked. The words came out before she could consider whether she wanted the answer. He was silent for 4 seconds, the longest silence she'd heard from him in this conversation. His eyes, those impossible, layered eyes, held steady on her face. "What I am does not process attachment the way you understand it. The soul I carry has loved and lost across spans of time that would break a human mind to comprehend." He paused. "One beat. But the boy who heard your voice for 4 years, the part of me that integrated within this body, that was shaped by your presence before any other influence touched it. That part holds you as the fixed point against which everything else is measured. I built a world in which your continued existence is a condition I will enforce with the full weight of everything I possess. In the vocabulary available to what I am, that is the closest expression to what you are asking." Inko pressed her hands against her mouth. The tears came faster. She was sobbing, the kind of sob that shakes the chest and makes breathing a conscious effort. Izuku stood. He walked to the counter. Izuku stood. He walked to the counter. He filled her kettle. He set it on the stove and turned on the burner and took 2 cups from the cabinet above the sink, the second shelf, left side, where she'd always kept them. He knew where the cups were. 11 years gone, and he knew where the cups were because he'd watched her put them there through every future Die Almacht showed him, or because he remembered from the 4 years his open eyes had never seen this kitchen, but his awareness had mapped it completely. He made tea. He set a cup in front of her. He sat back down. They drank in silence for a while. The television murmured in the living room. The evening light through the kitchen window was amber and fading. A mother and her son at a kitchen table. The distance between them so vast, it looped back around to proximity. Two people who had been separated by something larger than geography and found themselves, in this moment, close enough for tea. "I won't see you again for a while," he said when the cups were empty. "What comes next requires my full attention, but you remain protected. My awareness remains on this location. And when the world I am building is complete, when what comes after is stable enough to inhabit, I will bring you into it. You will understand then what I replaced and why." She reached across the table, her hand, smaller than his now, her son's hands larger than her own, when had that happened, covered his fingers where they rested on the porcelain cup. He let her hold his hand for 30 seconds. His skin was warm. His pulse was steady beneath her fingertips, the same rhythm she'd pressed her ear against for 4 years. Unchanged, unwavering. The heartbeat of something older than the body producing it, that still beating inside the boy she'd fed and held and talked to through silence. Then he stood. He withdrew his hand. He walked toward the kitchen shadow and paused at its edge. "The rabbit in the story wore the boots to the sea," he said without turning. "You skipped that page every time because the illustration made you cry. The rabbit's boots were too large because they belonged to its mother." Inko's sob hit the air like something breaking. The rabbit's boots. The page she'd skipped. The detail she'd never told another living soul. Had never explained to the doctors or the neighbors or her husband before he left or anyone in 11 years of searching. He knew. Because he'd been there. Because he'd heard her skip that page 40 times and understood, with whatever consciousness was integrating inside his silent body, why she couldn't read it. Because a rabbit wearing its dead mother's boots was something that made Izuku Midoriya cry, and the being that would become the most powerful entity on Earth had cataloged that fact with the same attention he gave to everything she'd ever done in his presence. He stepped into the shadow. The kitchen was empty. The cup sat where he'd left it, half a ring of tea still in the bottom. Inko held the cup between her hands until the porcelain went cold. In the hours after Izuku left his mother's apartment in the Silburn's lower corridors, where the spiritual energy pulsed closer to the walls and the light took on a bluer cast, Toga was alone. She was in a hallway outside the throne room. The guards had cycled to their rest positions. The chamber was empty. Izuku had gone to see his mother, and the palace held its breath the way it always did when he was absent. The energy in the walls dimming slightly, the rhythm slowing, waiting for the heartbeat at its center to return. Toga pulled something from inside her coat. A photograph, creased, water-damaged, kept in a pocket close to her skin for months. She'd taken it during the UA operation. A still frame from a camera feed she'd accessed while wearing the face of a news technician. It showed Izuku in profile, the moment before he fired the first Hylic file, his face in three-quarter view, the bow manifesting above him. His expression in that frame was the one she carried with her everywhere, the one that meant everything to her and nothing to anyone else who looked at it. She pressed the photograph against her chest. Her eyes closed. Her body, the shape-shifting, blood-drinking body the world called monstrous, went still in a way that looked like prayer from a distance. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. What she carried for him existed past the boundary where words had meaning. He was the first person who had looked at her nature and said yes. He was the first and only person who had given her something without taking first. The devotion that produced was absolute in a way that needed no declaration, because declarations were for things that could be argued. What she felt could never be argued. It simply was. She opened her eyes. She put the photograph back. She straightened her coat and walked toward her quarters with the same sharp-toothed smile she always wore. And if anyone had been watching, they would have seen the smile hold steady and genuine all the way to her door. In the resistance facility, in a private room she'd commandeered for analysis work, Momo Yaoyorozu was surrounded by data. Screens covered every wall. Energy readings, timeline analyses, combat footage from 4 separate encounters broken into frame-by-frame sequences. Mathematical models she'd built from scratch because the existing frameworks her education provided were useless against what she was trying to understand. Her models kept producing the same result. The being she was analyzing operated on principles that were internally consistent. His stated philosophy, the dissolution of a system built on fear, the replacement of a false piece with something permanent, followed a logic that her mathematical mind could trace from premise to conclusion without encountering contradiction. His actions matched his declarations. His resource deployment matched his stated goals. His treatment of opponents, incapacitation without killing, power removal without destruction, aligned with a framework that valued collection over elimination. She had been running these models for 8 weeks. Every iteration confirmed the same thing. The mind behind the Wandenreich's operations was the most sophisticated strategic intelligence she had ever encountered. Its planning horizon exceeded anything in recorded military or hero history. Its resource management was flawless. Its information advantage was total. There was a moment, sitting alone at 2 a.m, the screens glowing around her, her latest model complete and confirming what every prior model had already shown, where Momo Yaoyorozu allowed herself to think a thought she would never speak aloud. She understood him. She understood the logic. She could see, from inside the mathematics, why the hero system as constructed was inherently fragile, why a single point of failure, whether All Might or anyone else, created vulnerability that would always eventually be exploited. Why the ranking system incentivized competition over cooperation. Why the Commission's centralized model guaranteed that destroying one building could cripple an entire nation's response capability. He was right about the problem. She closed her laptop, she deleted the model. She went to bed and did not sleep, and in the morning she attended the resistance briefing and said nothing about what her mathematics had shown her. But the thought stayed, lodged somewhere behind her analytical mind like a splinter. The acknowledgement that the most dangerous person alive was also, possibly, the most coherent thinker she had ever studied. She pushed it down. She was a hero. She believed in what heroes represented. But the thought was there, and it would stay there. And every time she looked at the data, it would surface again with the quiet insistence of something that refused to be incorrect. Hawks gave the order on a Wednesday morning. The operation launched at 2300 hours. The window his analysts had identified, the 4% dip in the Silburn's dimensional boundary. 3 strike teams, 41 heroes, 12 students. Every piece of equipment the Resistance had assembled over 3 months of preparation. The students went first. They breached the boundary at a point as Hawk's sensors indicated was weakest, a location in the abandoned subway system beneath Musutafu where the dimensional fold pressed closest to physical space. Bakugo was at the front. His explosions blasted through the weakened barrier in a cascade of force that tore the membrane between dimensions open wide enough for the team behind him to follow. They were inside. The Silburn's corridors stretched before them, white stone, blue light pulsing in the walls, the air carrying a weight that pressed against their quirks like resistance in a current. The palace was vast. The ceilings rose 20 meters above them. The passages branched in patterns that shouldn't have been possible given the physical space they occupied. They moved forward. Uraraka was maintaining a gravity reduction on the entire group, keeping them light, keeping them fast, her fingers pressed together in the pattern that held her quirk active. Ida was running point behind Bakugo, his engines at half output to conserve fuel for engagement. Shoto moved in the center of the formation, his burns healed, his ice and fire ready, his face carrying the specific blankness of someone who had been inside the home of the person they were facing, and understood what that meant. They passed through 3 corridors without opposition, then 4, then 5. The silence was wrong. They'd expected guards, Sternritter, some form of resistance that would confirm they were fighting something real. The silence stretched. The corridors stretched. The blue light pulsed in the walls, and the air pressed against them, and everything about their advance felt like walking deeper into something that wanted them there. They reached the central chamber. Izuku stood at the far end, alone, his white coat catching the blue light from the walls, his hands at his sides, his expression carrying the same certainty it carried in every piece of footage they'd studied, in every encounter they'd witnessed, in every nightmare 3 months of proximity to his actions had produced. You are here. His voice filled the chamber without effort. Every student heard it at the same volume regardless of their position in the formation. I allowed you to be here. Do you understand what that means? Bakugo moved. He launched from the formation before anyone could call his name. Propulsion at maximum, both palms firing simultaneously, his body a projectile aimed at the figure at the end of the chamber. 3 months of fury compressed into one charge. The humiliation at UA, his arms seizing, his body hitting the ground, the helplessness he'd never experienced before and had spent every day since trying to outrun. All of it behind one attack, his largest explosion detonated point blank. Both palms. Full output. The blast wave expanded outward and hit the walls and came back, and the sound was enormous, filling the chamber, bouncing off the white stone, rattling the students behind him. The smoke was dense. The heat was intense. Everything Katsuki Bakugo could produce from the palms that had made him the strongest combatant in his class, the smoke cleared. Izuku stood in the same position. Same posture, same expression. His coat was undisturbed, his hair was unmoved. His hands remained at his sides. bnha had absorbed the full output of Bakugo's maximum capacity detonation, and the result was nothing. 0 damage, 0 displacement, 0 acknowledgement that an attack had occurred. Bakugo was 3 meters from him, close enough to see his own reflection in those layered eyes, close enough to watch the smoke dissipate around a body that his strongest effort had failed to affect. His palms sparked. Once. Twice. Trying to fire again. His body wanted to fight. Every muscle, every instinct, every piece of his identity demanded another attempt. But his hands remembered what happened at UA. The phantom pain in his right arm pulsed, and something in him, something deeper than his fury, something older than his pride, recognized what stood before him and felt the gap between them like a physical distance he would never cross. Then the spiritual pressure expanded. Izuku didn't move. His expression didn't change. But the air in the chamber went thick. It went heavy in a way that had nothing to do with temperature or humidity. A weight that pressed against the quirk factor in every body present and told it to be silent. Bakugo's palms went dry. The nitroglycerin ceased production. His quirk, the ability that had defined him since childhood, that had shaped his identity and his future and his understanding of his own worth, went quiet inside him like a sound fading below hearing threshold. He hit the ground. His knees gave first, then his hands. The weight on his body doubled, tripled. He was face down on the white stone floor, and his quirk was silent, and his body was pinned by something he couldn't see or fight or explode. Behind him, every student in the formation dropped simultaneously. Uraraka lost her hold, her fingers releasing involuntarily as her quirk went dormant, the gravity reduction vanishing, her body hitting the ground alongside everyone else. Ida's engines sputtered dead, his legs seized. He collapsed mid-stride and slid 2 meters on the polished floor. Shoto's ice manifested for half a second. Instinct, the automatic response of a body that had been trained to produce barriers when threatened. Then the ice dissolved. His fire flickered once and died. Both sides of his quirk, the dual nature his father had spent decades breeding into existence, went silent simultaneously. He dropped to one knee, then both, then flat against the stone. Every student, every one of them. The combined strength of UA's best, the generation that was supposed to be the future of heroism, pinned to the floor of the Silburn by proximity alone. Izuku walked forward. His steps echoed in the chamber, steady, even, the same pace he'd carried since he was 4 years old. He walked through the formation of prone students the way a person walks through a garden. He reached the center of the hall and turned. You fought your hardest. His voice reached them through the weight pressing on their bodies, clear, undistorted, spoken at conversational volume and arriving at each ear with perfect clarity. Keep that. Remember it. It is the last thing you will have left when you accept what comes next. He released the pressure. Gradually, or rather, the weight receded the way a tide recedes, pulling back from the students' bodies, allowing air back into their lungs, allowing their quirks to flicker tentatively back to life. They gasped. They retched. They pushed themselves off the floor with shaking arms and looked at each other and at the figure standing among them with expressions that ranged from horror to fury to something that was neither, something that existed in the space where understanding begins. Izuku looked across the chamber. His gaze found Shoto Todoroki, on his knees, his dual-colored hair hanging over his face, his body trembling with the after effect of total quirk suppression. Your brother is whole. Izuku's voice aimed itself at Shoto with the precision of an arrow. The man who built you as a weapon against himself broke first. Remember which one I chose. He turned. He walked toward the far wall of the chamber. A shadow gate opened before him, the dimensional tear appearing in response to his proximity, the way a door opens for a king in his own palace. He stopped at its edge, without turning. You came here to prove something to yourselves. You proved it. Hold on to what that felt like. The world you inhabit from this moment forward was built by my hand, and the people who live in it will be the ones who learned to accept that fact. You have a choice about how that acceptance arrives. He stepped through. The gate closed. The chamber was empty except for 32 students, standing, kneeling, sitting on the white stone floor of a palace they had broken into and would leave alive, because the person they came to fight decided their survival served his purpose more than their death would. Bakugo was on his feet. His palms were active again, small sparks, the quirk returning to baseline function. He stood in the center of the chamber and his jaw was locked and his fists were clenched, and his entire body carried the rigid tension of maximum fury. He said nothing. The others looked at him. They expected the explosion, the screaming, the cursing, the violent denial that was as much a part of him as his quirk. They expected rage that would fill the chamber the way Izuku's pressure had filled it moments ago. Bakugo said nothing. He walked toward the breach point. He walked with his shoulders locked and his head forward, and his palms producing sparks that lit nothing and pushed nothing and moved nothing. He walked out of the Silburn in silence, and the silence coming from Katsuki Bakugo was a sound louder than any explosion his quirk had ever produced. Uraraka watched him go. Her own body was still trembling. The quirk suppression had left her feeling hollow, like someone had reached inside and turned off a light she'd been running on without knowing it. She looked at the chamber around them, at the white stone and the blue light, and the space that existed between dimensions, built by the spiritual force of one person. She was 18 years old. She had wanted to be a hero since childhood. She had believed with everything she had that enough determination and enough training and enough goodness could overcome anything. She stood in the palace of a god and felt the last support beam of that belief bend under a weight it was never built to carry. 2 days after the students returned from the Silburn, Hawks activated his final operation. Every asset, every hero, every piece of technology and intelligence and capability the Resistance had assembled. The timing was coordinated with the remnants of the International Support Network. Satellite coverage provided by nations too afraid to send more heroes but willing to offer eyes in the sky. Communication relays bounced through 7 countries to avoid interception. The operation was the single largest coordinated hero movement since the HPSC's fall. They hit the dimensional boundary from 9 points simultaneously. The breaches opened. The heroes poured through. For one full page of the world's story, for 30 seconds of real time, the operation moved with momentum that felt like purpose, like belief in action. Like 41 heroes and everything they represented pushing back against the current that had swept everything else away, they emerged inside the Silburn's outer districts, the regions beyond the palace proper where dimensional space stretched into something resembling geography. Open ground, white stone structures, the architecture of an empire that existed outside physics. Izuku stood at the center of the open ground. His hands were at his sides. His coat moved in a wind the physical world wasn't producing. His eyes, already active, always active, watched 41 heroes spread across his territory and take their positions and ready their abilities. He raised his hand. Oswald descended. The light came from above. White. Total. Absolute. A pillar of brilliance that was everything and nothing. The pure expression of a power that existed beyond what this world's concepts could contain. It didn't strike like lightning. It didn't fall like rain. It appeared, present where it had been absent a moment before, filling the space above the assembled heroes like a sky being replaced. The pulling began. Quirks first. The biological mechanisms that generated each hero's ability, torn free from their bodies and drawn upward into the light. The process was visible. Heroes watched their hands stop glowing, watched their barriers dissolve, watched the powers they had built their identities around rip away from them like tape being pulled off skin. Then deeper. The energy beneath the quirks, the life force, the vitality, the capacity to stand and fight and resist, all of it drawn upward. Heroes dropped, one by one. Like puppets whose strings were being cut in sequence, legs giving out, arms going slack, bodies hitting the white stone ground of the Silburn's outer districts. They didn't die. Izuku had decided they would live. The Ausweilen took their power, their strength, their ability to continue, but left the biological minimum. Left heartbeats and breath and consciousness enough to know what was happening. Left awareness so they could feel themselves become less. 36 heroes dropped in the first 8 seconds. 5 more in the next 2. The operation, 41 strong, the best the resistance could assemble, lay scattered across the white stone like fallen leaves. Hawks was the last one standing. His feathers were gone. Every single one, pulled from his wings by the Ausweilen's force, drawn upward into the light, leaving behind bare wing frames that looked skeletal without their covering. His speed was gone. His precision was gone. Everything that made Hawks the fastest hero in Japan, everything his career had been built upon was ascending into the sky, and he felt each piece leave him like fingers being pulled from his hands. But he was standing. His legs were under him. His body was holding. He looked across the open ground at Izuku. 50 meters between them, 41 heroes on the ground. The light still present above them, still pulling, still taking the last remnants of what the resistance had brought to this fight. Izuku lowered his hand. The Ausweilen receded, the light dimming, the pulling ceasing, the sky returning to whatever the Silburn used in place of atmosphere. What it left behind was silence and bodies and one hero who remained upright through something that had nothing to do with power. You built this in 3 months. Izuku's voice crossed the 50 meters between them without effort. I watched you build it from the first meeting. Every move, every hero you recruited, every contingency you planned, I allowed all of it. Because the world needs to see the best the hero system could assemble fail at the moment it believed it was winning. Hawks stood there, wingless, powerless, his body stripped of everything his career had given it. He was a man in a jacket standing on white stone, surrounded by unconscious colleagues, facing a god who had watched him prepare for 3 months the way a person watches weather approach, aware of it, unbothered, certain of how it would end. He had one question. It had been sitting in him since before the commission fell, since the first report he filed about spiritual energy readings and vanishing individuals, since the first time he'd looked at the data and understood before anyone else in the hero system that what was coming was beyond response. Why heroes? Hawks asked. His voice was raw, stripped of the casual ease he'd worn his entire career. You could have replaced the government, the military, any institution. You chose heroes first. You went after us before anything else. Why? Izuku looked at him. Die Allmacht showed every possible response and every consequence of each. And he chose to answer honestly because Hawks had earned honesty by understanding earlier than anyone else and fighting anyway. Because heroes are the lie the world tells itself about power. Izuku's words fell into the silence between them with the weight of something carved in stone. A government admits it rules through force. A military admits it exists to destroy. But heroes sell violence as virtue. They teach children that strength in service of the strong is justice. They build a world where the people who can hit hardest are the people who decide what is right. And then they give that world a smile and tell it the smile means safety. Hawks listened. His bare wing frames trembled behind him. I tore the heroes down first because they are the foundation beneath the lie. Remove them and the world sees what was always underneath. A species that organized its safety around the genetic lottery of who was born with the most destructive ability. I did not target a system. I targeted an illusion, and illusions die when you remove the people performing them. Hawks closed his eyes, opened them. He'd known. Somewhere in the 3 months of planning, in the reports he filed and the operations he organized, he'd known the answer to his own question. He'd known and he'd fought anyway because he was the kind of person who fought even when the math was against him. His legs gave out. He sat on the white stone, deliberate, choosing to descend rather than fall. He looked at his unconscious colleagues, at the bare wing frames behind him that would never carry feathers again, at the figure in white already turning away, already walking toward the shadow gate at the edge of the open ground. Hawks sat on the ground and watched Izuku walk away at the same pace he always walked, the same unhurried stride he'd carried since the first footage from UA. The walk of someone who has never needed to rush because every outcome he wants is already decided. The cameras. Hawks had worn a body cam, standard resistance protocol, documentation of operations. The camera was still running. It had captured everything, the heroes falling, the Oswalen descending, the conversation, Hawks sitting on the ground as the most powerful being alive walked away from the wreckage of the last organized resistance the hero world would ever produce. That footage would reach the public within 24 hours. Every screen in Japan would show Hawks, the fastest hero in the country, the infiltration specialist, the man whose career was built on being everywhere first, sitting on white stone with empty wings and empty hands, and the expression of someone who asked a question and received an answer that ended something inside him. Endeavor found Izuku 3 days later. His body was running at 40%. The recovery from the commission battle had plateaued. His physicians told him the remaining damage was permanent, that his output ceiling had been structurally reduced, that pushing past it would risk cardiac failure. He heard this the way he heard everything that told him to stop. He filed it somewhere behind the furnace in his chest and continued forward. He didn't find Izuku through intelligence or tracking or any technical means. He found him because Izuku allowed himself to be found. The rooftop of a commercial building in central Musutafu, 12 stories up, overlooking the city. The kind of location that only meant something if the person standing on it wanted to be seen. Izuku stood at the edge. His white coat moved in the evening wind. The city spread beneath him, lights coming on as dusk settled, streets full of people moving through lives that had been restructured around realities they were still learning to name. Endeavor landed on the rooftop behind him, his flames at full, which was half of what full used to mean. The heat distortion coming off his body was visible, but reduced. The man who had chased the #1 rank for 40 years stood behind the being the front of the being who had made that rank meaningless and felt the distance between them like a physical measurement. He didn't speak first. He'd used up his words at the commission. He'd said, "You're going through me." And then the palm strike had driven him through a wall, and the next thing he'd been aware of was medical teams extracting him from concrete. Words had failed him then. He refused to waste them now. He attacked. Prominence burn. Everything. His remaining output pushed to the red line his physicians warned him about. The heat hit temperatures that melted the rooftop surface beneath his feet. Asphalt and concrete liquefying from proximity alone. He drove the concentrated stream toward Izuku's back with everything his body could still produce. The fire reached Izuku. It parted around him, like a river around a stone, like wind around a cliff face. The flames split at the point of his body and flowed past him on both sides, rejoining behind him, leaving the figure at the rooftop's edge untouched in the center of a torrent that would have killed anything else present. Endeavor pushed harder. His body screamed warnings. The cardiac stress alerts, the temperature feedback telling him his own organs were approaching damage threshold. He overrode everything, 40 years of pushing past limits, the one thing Endeavor had always been able to do better than anyone else. He pushed and the fire roared, and Izuku stood in it the way he stood in everything. Present. Unbothered. Waiting for it to end. Endeavor switched. Hell Spider. Threads of concentrated flame, thinner and hotter than the Prominence burn, designed to cut rather than engulf. They lashed across the rooftop in patterns that his decades of combat experience had honed to perfection. 12 threads simultaneously, each aimed at a different angle, each cutting through the evening air with heat signatures that read like small stars on thermal imaging. The threads reached Izuku's body. They met Blutvini and stopped. Each one. Every thread of concentrated fire that touched his skin halted against spiritual armor and accomplished nothing beyond confirming what Endeavor already knew. What he'd known since the commission. What he was here to prove to himself one final time, before he could accept it. The flames burned around them. The rooftop was melting, the surface softening, the structure beneath groaning under thermal stress. Endeavor was at his edge, past his edge. His body was failing in real time, his vision narrowing, his heartbeat irregular, the warnings becoming screams. He launched one final combination. Everything sequenced. Prominence burn channeled through Hellspider's threading, creating a lattice of ultimate temperature fire that closed around Izuku's position from every direction simultaneously. His lifetime's work, his career's achievement. Every technique he developed across 40 years of chasing a rival, compressed into one final assault. Izuku turned around. The flames parted with his movement. They flowed around his body as he turned to face Endeavor, the way curtains part for someone walking through them. His expression unchanged, his coat unmarked, the city lights reflected in his layered eyes. You already knew how this ended. His voice cut through the roar of Endeavor's dying flames without rising above its usual register. You looked into my eyes at the commission and you saw it there. You are here because the man you are lacks the ability to stop trying. I respect that enough to give you what you came for. Dialmacht activated at full capacity. The pupils in Izuku's eyes cascaded outward, layering, deepening, opening into a vision that encompassed every possible future, branching from this moment. He saw Endeavor's remaining attacks. He saw the combinations. He saw the desperate last resort techniques that Endeavor had been developing in 3 months of recovery. New patterns, new applications, ideas born from the knowledge that what he had was insufficient, and the refusal to stop trying anyway. He reached forward across the boundary between present and future and removed every timeline where those attacks could reach him. Endeavor's fire extinguished. All of it. Every thread. Every flame. Every degree of heat his body was producing. Gone, snuffed in an instant, because the futures where his fire existed in proximity to Izuku's body had been erased before the fire could participate in them. His quirk was still active, his body was still producing heat internally, but the output, the expression of that heat into the external world, met a barrier that existed across time rather than across space. The future where his fire could reach this rooftop no longer existed. Endeavor stood there, his body still hot, his quirk still running, his fire, the thing that defined him, that he'd spent 40 years mastering, that he'd destroyed his family to produce a better version of, suppressed by something that his senses couldn't identify and his experience couldn't counter. Izuku walked toward him. 3 steps, his hand raised, open-palmed, reaching toward Endeavor's chest the way it had reached at the commission, Sanct Altar activated. His palm made contact with Endeavor's chest. The pulling began, but it was different this time. He wasn't taking the quirk. The fire stayed. The biological mechanism that produced Endeavor's flames remained intact inside his body. What Izuku took was everything behind it. The drive, the ambition, 40 years of furious, grinding, relentless pursuit, the engine that had pushed Enji Todoroki past limits that should have stopped him, past a family that should have mattered more, past every signal his own life sent him that said, stop, enough. This is doing damage. The will that had made Endeavor who he was, the thing that separated him from a man with a fire quirk and made him the #1 hero, tore free from his soul and flowed into Izuku's palm. Endeavor didn't scream. He made a sound, small, surprised, like someone waking from a dream they'd been having for decades. His eyes went wide, then they went empty. The fire behind them, the specific intensity that had been Enji Todoroki's defining characteristic since childhood, dimmed, went still, became something that existed without purpose. He stood on the rooftop with his quirk intact and nothing left inside him to use it for. Izuku withdrew his hand. You spent 40 years burning your way towards something that lived above you. His voice aimed at Endeavor the way one aims a final statement at a closed case. The fire was never the point. The fire was a vehicle for the will that drove it. I have taken the wheel from the vehicle. What remains is a man with heat and no direction. You will never push past a limit again. The part of you that knew how has come home with me. Endeavor's knees hit the rooftop. His body folded. His flames were still present, low, guttering, the baseline output of a quirk running without instruction. He knelt on the melted surface of a 12-story building and stared at his own hands and found nothing inside himself that wanted to close them into fists. Izuku turned away from him. He walked to the rooftop's edge and looked out at the city. Then he looked further. Die Allmacht at maximum activation, every pupil in his eyes cascading outward, the vision extending past the physical, past the temporal, into the branching infinities of every possible future this world could produce. He saw them all. Every timeline where organized hero resistance rebuilt, where a new commission formed from the ashes of the old, where a generation of students grew into professionals who assembled something capable of standing against him, where the international community recovered its nerve and sent a second force, where any combination of events, however unlikely, produced a world that could challenge what he had built. He reached across the boundary between present and possibility, future destruction. Every timeline where the hero world regenerated, erased. Every branch where organized resistance reformed, severed. Every possible future in which the system he had dismantled found its way back to functionality, removed from the spectrum of probability as if it had never existed. He didn't destroy one attack. He didn't break one arm. He reached into the fabric of what could be and tore out every thread that led anywhere except where he had already decided. It happened in silence. No light, no sound, no visible manifestation of power. To anyone watching, to the cameras on nearby buildings, to the satellites overhead, to the sensors that were still functioning across the country, nothing occurred. But every hero in Japan felt it. Mirko was in a rehabilitation facility in Osaka. She felt something go out, a direction, a possibility, a door that had always existed at the back of her mind, closing without sound. She stopped mid-exercise, her hands went to her chest. The feeling was sourceless and total, and she couldn't name it, but she knew what it meant. Hawks was in his apartment, wingless, grounded, planning nothing because there was nothing left to plan with. He felt it arrive, the sensation of every possible path forward narrowing to a single road. His hand went to the table for support. His legs went weak. Something fundamental had changed in the architecture of possibility, and his instincts, the ones that had kept him alive through a career of impossible operations, recognized it as finality. In the UA dormitories, Bakugo was awake. He was always awake now. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by phantom sensations in his right arm and dreams of smoke clearing to reveal unchanged eyes. He felt the door close. He felt the future narrow. His palms sparked once, reactive, defensive, and then went still. His body understood something his mind would take weeks to process. Across Japan, in hero agencies, in training facilities, in homes where retired heroes lived with the wounds of their service, people felt it. A direction they'd always been able to sense, the forward pull of possibility, the sense that tomorrow could be different from today, went still, went absent. The feeling of a current stopping, the feeling of reaching for a shelf that is suddenly no longer there. The era of heroes died on that rooftop. Its body had been broken at the commission, its symbols had been shattered in public, its infrastructure had been destroyed. But its possibility, the chance, however remote, that it could return, died in silence while a 15-year-old boy stood at the edge of a melted rooftop and looked into every possible future and removed the ones he didn't want. Endeavor knelt behind him, still kneeling, still empty, still holding fire in hands that had forgotten why they burned. The city below was unchanged. The lights still moved. The people still walked. The world continued its routine because the world hadn't felt what its heroes had felt. The world would learn, slowly over weeks and months, that the door it had always assumed was there, the possibility of return, of restoration, of the hero system rebuilding itself from whatever remained, was permanently closed. But the heroes knew, in that moment. Every one of them who still carried the training and the instinct and the specific sensitivity that came from living inside a power structure. They felt it end. They felt the possibility stop. And the boy who ended it walked off the rooftop into his own shadow and went home to his white throne. 3 weeks later, Toshinori Yagi found Izuku Midoriya's address in the phone records of the old commission files, the ones that had been preserved on physical paper rather than digital servers. He took a train. He walked 4 blocks from the station. He climbed 2 flights of stairs to apartment 3B and knocked. She opened the door and found a skeleton in a suit. A tall man, impossibly thin, his cheeks sunken, his eyes sitting deep in a face that had lost everything it once carried. His right arm was in a sling. The bone had set wrong. The ligaments had healed incomplete. He would carry the arm at an angle for the rest of his life, a permanent reminder of the punch that was broken before it was thrown. Midoriya-san. His voice, still carrying echoes of what it had been, still holding authority in its register even when the body producing it had none left to spare. My name is Toshinori Yagi. I was All Might. She said it for him. Because of course she knew. Every mother in Japan knew that face, the real one, the thin one, the one behind the smile. It had been on every screen for months. Could I come in? I have questions. I know you've been asked by everyone. I know I have no right, but... She stepped aside. She let him in. She made tea because that was what she did, because making tea for visitors was the one routine from her old life that still felt like her, that still belonged to the person she'd been before everything. They sat at the kitchen table. The same table. 2 cups of green tea that neither of them tasted. What was he like? Toshinori asked, his hands wrapped around the cup for warmth he couldn't feel. Before, when he was a child. Before everything. Inko looked at this man, at the ruins of what had been the strongest hero in history, sitting in her kitchen, holding tea with hands that shook, asking about a baby who never opened his eyes. He was still, she said, for 4 years, perfectly still. His heart never changed rhythm, his breathing never varied. He lay in his crib and then in his bed, and his body was present, and whatever was inside it was somewhere else. Somewhere very far away. Did you know? That everyone knew something was wrong. The doctors used words like deep processing and anomalous integration. And once one neurologist said soul-level integration and then couldn't explain why he'd said it. Nobody understood. I didn't understand. I stayed with him. I talked to him. I read to him. And I told him about my day and about the weather and about what was on television. 4 years of talking to silence. Toshinori's eyes were wet. And he heard you. He heard everything. Her voice was steady. The tears were finished. She'd spent them during Izuku's visit, during the months before it, during the years of searching. What remained was something dry and clear. He came here 3 weeks ago. He sat where you're sitting. He told me he remembered all of it. Every story, every song, every word I ever spoke in that room. Toshinori set down his cup, his hands pressed flat against the table. Is there anything left in him? Of the boy? Of anything? Human? Anything that can be? Reached? Inko finished. She looked at the cup sitting where Izuku had left it. She'd washed it, of course, but she knew which cup it was. He told me something when he left, a detail about a book I used to read him, a book about a rabbit who wore boots. Toshinori waited. The rabbit in the story wore its mother's boots. They were too large. The rabbit wore them to the sea. Her hands tightened around her own cup. There was a page, one page with an illustration of the rabbit at the water's edge, wearing these enormous boots, looking small and lost. I never read that page aloud. Every time I reached it, I turned past it. Because the illustration the rabbit looked like, it looked how I felt, reading to a child who couldn't hear me, wearing a mother's love like something too large that she refused to put down. Toshinori's breath caught. He knew. Inko looked at the man across her table, at All Might, at the symbol of peace, at a man who had failed to stop her son and come here looking for something that would let him understand why. He knew I skipped that page. He knew why. He told me the rabbit's boots belonged to its mother. He told me the rabbit wore them to the sea. Details I never spoke aloud. He was there. Through 4 years of silence. He was hearing everything I couldn't say out loud. Toshinori sat with that. with the image of a child, motionless, eyes closed, brain integrating something that would destroy the world as they knew it, lying in a bed while his mother read to him and skipped pages she couldn't bear to voice. And that child, that soul, that being, that God in a baby's body, cataloging which pages she skipped, understanding why, carrying that knowledge into a new existence where it had no practical purpose and keeping it anyway. He's still in there, Toshinori said. Less a statement than a realization arriving in real time. He was always in there. Inko set her cup down. What he became, the power, the soldiers, the empire, none of that erased the boy who lay in silence. It grew around him, like a building growing around a seed. The seed is still there. It's just very small compared to what surrounds it now. Toshinori pressed his hands against his face. The sound he made was quiet and broken, and carried the weight of a man who had spent his career being strong enough for everyone, and now sat in a kitchen with nothing left to lift. He left an hour later. He walked down the stairs and into the evening, and his body carried him forward the way bodies do. Through momentum, through habit, through the basic biological imperative to keep moving, even when the person inside has stopped knowing where to go. Inko watched him leave from her window. Then she turned away. The television sat across the room, off for the first time in months. She'd turned it off the night Izuku visited, and she hadn't turned it back on. She went to the kitchen. She made tea. She drank it alone at the table where her son had sat. In the chair she hadn't moved. At the place setting she hadn't cleared. The evening light came through the window the same way it always had. The apartment held its silence the way it had held silence for 4 years. Steady, patient, accustomed to waiting. The world outside was becoming something with no name yet. The structures were changing. The rules were being written in a language the old world couldn't read. Heroes who still wore their costumes looked less like protectors and more like echoes, shapes of something that used to mean safety, walking through streets that had already accepted a different kind of order. She was still here. He'd said she would be. He had never said a thing he failed to mean. She finished her tea. She washed the cup. She put it on the second shelf, left side, where she'd always kept them, where he knew to find them, 3 months after future destruction. The country that had been Japan, hero-ranked, commission-organized, structured around a hierarchy of quirk-powered protectors, was something else now. In the Higashiyama district of Kyoto, a family of 4 lived in an apartment that hero patrols had stopped reaching 6 years before the commission fell. The neighborhood had been classified as low priority, too far from agency headquarters, too few high-profile incidents, the kind of area that ranking-focused heroes passed over because the work there didn't generate publicity. For 6 years, this family had locked their doors at 7 and hoped. Petty crime, break-ins, a man with a strength enhancement quirk running a protection racket from the convenience store at the corner, pay him monthly or things happen to your car, your windows, your children's walk to school. The man with the strength enhancement quirk was gone. He'd been gone for 2 months. A figure in white had appeared at his convenience store on a morning and spoken to him in a voice that carried no volume and total authority. And the man had packed a bag and left the district by noon. The family never learned what was said. They never saw the figure in white again. But the protection payments stopped. The break-ins stopped. The locked at 7 routine eased to locked at 9, then 10, then whenever they remembered. The mother told her neighbor it felt like weather changing, like a season that had lasted too long, finally turning. In Musutafu's southern industrial zone, a 17-year-old boy named Kenji Sato walked to a job he'd held for 3 months. He was quirkless, registered at 4, documented, categorized, slotted into the specific social stratum that his world reserved for people whose bodies produced nothing extraordinary. For 17 years, that categorization had determined everything. The schools that would accept him, the jobs that would hire him, the looks he received on trains and in waiting rooms, and in every space where people's eyes flickered to the registration band on his wrist and then away. Having assessed his worth in a glance, the registration bands were gone. The system that administered them was gone, housed in commission servers that would never reconnect to anything. The social infrastructure that gave quirkless status its weight was eroding in real time. leaking relevance the way a bucket leaks water when the bottom is cracked. Kenji's job was maintenance at a facility the Wandenreich had established in the industrial zone, one of dozens across the country. He repaired equipment, he adjusted systems. The work was unremarkable, and it paid twice what any other employer in the district had ever offered him, and nobody there had ever looked at his wrist. He didn't understand what the Wandenreich was. He didn't know the theology or the power structure or the specifics of what the being at its center intended for the world. He knew that the people in white treated him the same way they treated everyone who worked with them, with the assumption that he was capable unless proven otherwise. Without the preliminary assessment of his quirk status and fratus, without the categorization, it was enough. For now. It was more than 17 years of Japanese society had given him, and it was enough. In a housing complex in Yokohama, a woman named Akemi Tanaka, formerly affiliated with a criminal organization that operated debt collection services through intimidation, was learning to cook. She'd bent the knee to the Wandenreich 4 months ago. Her organization had been absorbed during the first wave of expansion after All for One's fall. She'd expected servitude, the same hierarchy, different boss, same violence at the bottom. What she'd received was different. Assignment to a community integration program, housing, a stipend, training in a civilian skill of her choice, any skill, anything she wanted to learn that would give her life a direction beyond what her criminal career had provided. The Sternritter who administered the program was a former nurse whose touch could heal or destroy, a woman with warm eyes who spoke to every participant like they were people rather than subordinates. Akemi was learning to cook because she'd never been allowed to learn anything that didn't serve the organization, because choosing something for herself, something soft, something productive, something that fed people rather than frightened them, felt like rebellion against every year she'd spent being muscle for men who never asked her name. She didn't know if the world being built was good. The scope of it was too large for her to judge from the kitchen of a housing complex in Yokohama. But the kitchen was warm and the instructor was patient, and the vegetables she was learning to cut would end up in a meal that someone would eat without fear. It was something. After 29 years of being a weapon someone else pointed, it was something. The Silbern pulsed with spiritual energy in rhythms that matched the heartbeat at its center. White stone, blue light. The architecture of an empire that existed in the spaces between what the physical world could measure. Izuku sat on his throne. The white stone was warm beneath him, reactive to his presence, responsive to his spiritual pressure, the palace itself a living extension of his will. Tuya at his right hand, Toga at his left. 43 Sternritter arrayed before him in the formation that had become ritual. Fists ready, bodies still, white uniforms reflecting the pulsing light, the futures spread before him. Die Allmacht showed them all. Every branching path, every possibility remaining after future destruction had removed the ones he decided against. What remained was narrower than what had existed before. More focused, moving toward a destination that was no longer a question of if, but only of when and how the final distance would be covered. One Sternritter stepped forward. Rai Kuroda, the first. Sternritter R, the reverse. The woman he'd found in a subway station 11 years ago, wrapped in chains, killing everything she touched. She stood straight now. Her hands were free. Her quirk, tamed, directed, 300 times more powerful than it had been the day she accidentally killed her daughter, sat inside her like a loyal animal, Your Majesty. Her voice was steady, respectful in the specific way of someone who owed everything to the person they addressed. What do you see in what comes next? Izuku looked past his soldiers, past the walls, past the dimensional boundary that separated the Silbern from the physical world. He looked into the futures, the remaining ones, the ones he'd chosen to allow, the ones that led to the destination he'd selected before the first Sternritter ever received a soul fragment. I see a world learning to stand without crutches, he said. His voice filled the chamber the way it always did. Without effort, without volume, occupying every corner of the space because the space recognized its owner. I see institutions rebuilt around strength that comes from within rather than symbols that stand above. I see the fear that drove this civilization for generations becoming unnecessary, because what they feared has already arrived and proven itself less destructive than the system they built to prevent it. He looked at his Sternritter, at the 43 people who carried pieces of his soul, who had been broken or discarded or destroyed by the world he was replacing, who stood in this chamber whole and powerful and aimed at a future they had chosen to serve. The transition completes itself now. What remains is management rather than conquest. The opposition that existed has been removed at its source, its symbols broken, its infrastructure dissolved, its ability to regenerate erased. What comes next is the work of building rather than the work of tearing down. He paused. His eyes, those layered, impossible eyes, settled into something the Sternritter had never seen before. Something quieter than the absolute authority they were accustomed to. Something that resembled, for one breath, the gaze of a person rather than the gaze of a force. "I have seen every future this world can produce," he said. "Every version of what comes after today. In every one of them, in every single branch of possibility that remains, what we built in this room outlasts everything that came before it. The era we are entering has already been written. The only remaining question is what you choose to do within it. That question, unlike every other question in this world, I leave for each of you to answer." He sat back. The spiritual energy in the walls pulsed once, strong, steady, final. The rhythm of a heart that had been beating since before this body existed, the rhythm that had carried him through 4 years of silence and 11 years of construction, and every confrontation and declaration and every moment where the world tried to push back against what he was and failed. Tuya shifted at his right hand, a half smile on his whole face, the face that had never burned, the skin that held every degree his fire could produce. He looked at the Sternritter below and felt the specific satisfaction of someone who found his place in the world and has no intention of moving from it. Toga leaned against the arm of her stone chair. Her yellow eyes were bright. Her sharp-toothed smile held genuine warmth, the specific warmth of someone who had been told she was a monster her entire life and found the one person in existence who said otherwise and meant it. The Silbern hummed. The Wandenreich stood in formation. The world above continued its adjustment, learning to orbit the strongest force in its history, learning to live inside rules it didn't write, learning that the era it had known was over, and what came next was already moving beneath its feet like tectonic forces that answered to a single will. Somewhere above them, in an apartment in Musutafu, a woman finished her tea and looked at the window. The evening was ordinary. The sounds of the city were the sounds of any city, traffic, voices, the distant rhythm of a civilization in motion. Nothing about the evening announced itself as historical. Nothing about it declared an ending or a beginning, but something had settled. Something in the air, in the weight of it, in the way it moved through windows and across streets, had found a new resting point. The world had stopped fighting its own shift. The resistance had ended, because resistance required a future in which success was possible, and that future had been removed from the spectrum of what could be. What remained was the present. The world as it existed in this moment, under the authority of a being who had seen every possible version of it and selected the one he wanted. A world where the strong served a purpose instead of a ranking, where the discarded were collected instead of abandoned, where the specific lie of hero society, that violence in service of the powerful constituted justice, had been dismantled with the same absolute certainty that dismantled everything else in its path. Izuku Midoriya sat on his throne in the Silbern, and the futures moved around him like currents in water. All of them flowing in the direction he had chosen. All of them carrying the world toward the destination he had already verified through eyes that saw everything and chose what remained. The city moved above him. The people lived. The season turned. And the boy who remembered being a god, who had integrated a soul older than civilization into a body born to a woman who read him stories about rabbits, watched the world settle into its new shape and felt, for the first time since awakening, that the distance between what he was and what he had built was closing. The work was beginning. The kingdom was established. The opposition was ended at its root. Its heroes broken, its systems dissolved, its possible futures erased. What came next was the thing that existed after victory. The long, slow, permanent work of making what replaced the old world worthy of replacing it. He would do that work. Because he was thorough. Because everything he had ever said was a thing he meant. Because a world without the suffering that produced heroes and villains in equal measure was a world worth the price of building it. And the price had already been paid in full by everyone who had stood in his way and learned what standing in his way accomplished. The era of heroes was over. The era of the Emperor had begun. And the only future that existed was the one already chosen by the being who sat at the center of everything. Patient, absolute, and moving forward at the pace that belonged to him alone. In the end, there was only the throne and the city and the silence between them. The specific silence of a world that had finished resisting and started slowly to breathe under the weight of something new.
The hero roster. A massive salute to the legends backing this journey. Your support is what keeps the momentum at an all-time high and the dream moving forward. You guys are the absolute best. Pro heroes. The elite front line, stepping up and setting the pace for the whole community. DA, Fire 05.
Symbol of peace. The pillars of the community. The titans who keep our foundations solid and the hype at an all-time high. Alexander Igarza. That guy Miso. Deck. Lydell Scott Jr., James Martin, Victor Laroux, Rune Brokstad, Ariuse Bryant, Jonah Wheeler, T-Mac, XXHJRX3A7XX, Hyperbeams, Michael Murphy, Grand Region Kell, Sin Hunter, Logan Bland, Alexander Johannes, Alex Morgan, Ray Various, That Other Guy Too, Chad Reynolds, T. Mackie 68 Rimuru, A. Zetros, Dweller of the Deepest Depths, Lone Wolf, Jacob Ropes, Bully Maguire Shadow, Rathakit Thitiratnan Thakul, Neostar Productions, Asael Cardenas, Shaquan Simmons, Thunder, Sunawin 631, Elijah Saunders, Peter Hamilton, Freddie Rose, Omega, Akuma Noakami, Remorsefuls, Black Vein, Joshua Hedrington, Aaron Abercrombie, Drift SK8ER, Corey Tokars, Jan, Devin Black, Crow, Joe Bros, Ray Von Crimson River, Dante Alastor, Adam Yonkers, Blood Saints, Donna Cafe, Zeph, KC, Howie 60, Ignacio. Hope of the universe, the ultimate guardians, celestial tier supporters whose impact literally shines across the galaxy. Void Rot, Chaos Umbre, Noroi Uzumaki Uchiha, Tyshawn Palmer, Coldbane 4, The Maniac 563, Debs, LS Morningstar, Marl, Spintown, I Shoot X50, Greg Green, James, Q Hon Yen Thompson, Juan, and Zeno KJ. Thanks for watching this insane full story. If you loved this dark Deku glow-up as much as I did, hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and drop a like to support more epic what-if content. Drop your thoughts in the comments. What did you think of Emperor Izuku? See you in the next one.